Section 1 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Jennifer Wigginton. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 1, The Discovery. Chapter 1, The Sky Cube. The doctor, who was easily the most musical of the four men, sang in a cheerful baritone. The owl and the pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea-green boat. The geologist, who had held down the lower end of a quartet in his university days, growled an accompaniment under his breath as he blithely peeled the potatoes. Occasionally a high-pitched note or two came from the direction of the engineer. He could not spare much wind while clambering about the machinery, oil can in hand. The architect alone ignored the famous tune. "What I can't understand, Smith," he insisted, "is how you draw the electricity from the ether into this car without blasting us all to cinders." The engineer squinted through an oval glass shutter into one of the tunnels, through which the anti-gravitation current was pouring. "If you don't know any more about building than you do about machinery, Jackson," he grunted because of his squatting position, "I'd hate to live in one of your houses." The architect smiled grimly. "You're living in one of 'em right now, Smith," said he. "That is, if you call this car a house." Smith straightened up. He was an unimportant-looking man of medium height and build, and bearing a mild, good-humored expression. Nobody would ever look at him twice, and would ever guess that his skull concealed an unusually complete knowledge of electricity, mechanisms, and such practical matters. "I told you yesterday, Jackson," he said, "that the air surrounding the earth is chock full of electricity. And that the higher we go the more juice," added the other, remembering. "As much as to say that it is the atmosphere, then, that protects the earth from the surrounding voltage." The engineer nodded. "Occasionally it breaks through, anyhow, in the form of lightning. Now, in order to control that current and prevent it from turning this machine, and us, into ashes, all we do is to pass the juice through a cylinder of highly compressed air fixed in this wall. By varying the pressure and dampness within the cylinder we can regulate the flow." The builder nodded rapidly. "All right, but why doesn't the electricity affect the walls themselves? I thought they were made of steel." The engineer glanced through the dead light at the reddish disk of the earth, hazy and indistinct at a distance of 40 million miles. "It isn't steel, it's a non-magnetic alloy. Besides, there's a layer of crystalline sulfur between the alloy and the vacuum space." "The vacuum is what keeps out the cold, isn't it?" Jackson knew, but he asked in order to learn more. "Keeps out the sun's heat, too. The outer shell is pretty blamed hot on that side, just as hot as it is cold on the shady side." Smith seated himself beside a huge electrical machine, a rotary converter, which he next indicated with a jerk of his thumb. "But you don't want to forget that the juice outside is no use to us the way it is. We have to change it. It's neither positive nor negative, it's just neutral. So we separate it into two parts, and all we have to do, when we want to get away from the earth or any other magnetic sphere, is to aim a bunch of positive current at the corresponding pole of the planet, or negative current at the other pole. Like poles repel, you know." "Sounds easy," commented Jackson. "Too easy." "Well, it isn't exactly as simple as all that. Takes a lot of apparatus, all told." And the engineer looked around the room, his glance resting fondly on his beloved machinery. The big room, 50 feet square, was almost filled with machines. Some reached nearly to the ceiling, the same distance above. In fact, the interior of the cube, as that form of sky car was known, had very little waste space. The living quarters of the four men who occupied it had to be fitted in wherever there happened to be room. The architect's own berth was sandwiched in between two huge dynamos. He was thinking hard. "I see now why you have such a lot of adjustments for those tunnels," meaning the 6 square tubes which opened into the ether through the 6 walls of the room. "You've got to point the juice pretty accurately." "I should say so." Smith led the way to a window, and the two shaded their eyes from the lights within while they gazed at the ashy glow of Mercury, toward which they were traveling. "I've got to adjust the current so as to point exactly toward his northern half." Smith might have added that a continual stream of repellent current was still directed toward the earth, and another toward the sun, away over to their right, both to prevent being drawn off their course. "And how fast are we going?" "4 or 5 times as fast as Mother Earth, between 80 and 90 miles per second. It's easy to get up speed out here, of course, where there's no air resistance." Another voice broke in. The geologist had finished his potatoes, and a savory smell was already issuing from the frying pan. Years spent in the wilderness had made the geologist a good cook, and doubly welcome as a member of the expedition. "We ought to get there tomorrow, then," he said eagerly. Indoor life did not appeal to him, even under such exciting circumstances. He peered at Mercury through his binoculars. "Beginning to show up fine now." The builder improved upon Van Emmon's example by setting up the car's biggest telescope, a 4-inch tube of unusual excellence. All three pronounced the planet, which was 3/4 full as they viewed it, as having pretty much the appearance of the moon. "Wonder why there's always been so much mystery about Mercury," pondered the architect invitingly. "Looks as though the big 5-foot telescope on Mount Wilson would have shown everything." "Ask Doc," suggested Smith diplomatically. Jackson turned and held the little man on the other side of the car. He looked up absently from the scientific apparatus with which he had been making a test of the room's chemically purified air. Then he stepped to the oxygen tanks and closed the flow a trifle, referring to his figures in the severely exact manner of his craft. He crossed to the group. "Mercury is so close to the sun," he answered the architect's question. "He's always been hard to observe. For a long time the astronomers couldn't even agree that he always keeps the same face toward the sun, like the moon toward the earth. Then his day is as long as his year. 88 of our days, yes." "Continual sunlight. He can't be inhabited, then?" The architect knew very little about the planets. He had been included in the party because, along with his professional knowledge, he possessed remarkable ability as an amateur antiquarian. He knew as much about the doings of the ancients as the average man knows of baseball. Dr. Kinney shook his head. "Not at present, certainly." Instantly Jackson was alert. "Then perhaps there were people there at one time." "Why not?" the doctor put in lightly. "There's little or no atmosphere there now, of course, but that's not saying there never has been. Even if he is such a little planet, less than 3,000, smaller than the moon, he must have had plenty of air and water at one time, the same as the earth." "What's become of the air?" Van Emmon wanted to know. Kinney eyed him in reproach. He said, "You ought to know. Mercury has only 2/5 as much gravitation as the earth. A man weighing 150 back home would be only a 60-pounder there, and you can't expect stuff as light as air to stay forever on a planet with no more pull than that, when the sun is on the job only 36 million miles away." "About a third as far as the earth to the sun," commented the engineer. "By George, it must be hot." "On the sunlit side, yes," said Kinney. "On the dark side it is as cold as space itself, 460 below Fahrenheit." They considered this in silence for some minutes. The builder went to another window and looked at Venus, at that time about 60 million miles distant, on the far side of the sun. They were intending to visit Earth's twin sister on their return. After a while he came back to the group, ready with another question. "If Mercury was ever inhabited, then his day wasn't as long as it is now, was it?" "No," said the doctor. "In all probability he once had a day the same length as ours. Mercury is a comparatively old planet, you know. Being smaller, he cooled off earlier than the earth, and has been more affected by the pull of the sun. But it's been a mighty long time since he had a day like ours. Before the earth was cool enough to live on, probably." "But since Mercury was made out of the same batch of material," prompted the geologist. "No reason, then, why life shouldn't have existed there in the past," exclaimed the architect, his eyes sparkling with the instinct of the born antiquarian. He gazed up eagerly as the doctor coughed apologetically and said, "Don't forget that, even if Mercury is part baked and part frozen, there must be a region in between which is neither." He picked up a small globe from the table and ran a finger completely around it from pole to pole. "So. There must be a narrow band of country where the sun is only partly above the horizon and where the climate is temperate. Then," the architect almost shouted in his excitement, an excitement only slightly greater than the other two, "then if there were people on Mercury at one time—" The doctor nodded gravely. "There may be some there now." End of section 1. Recorded by Jennifer Wigginton. Section 2 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Jennifer Wigginton. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 1, The Discovery, Chapter 2, A Dead City. From a height of a few thousand miles, Mercury, at first glance, strongly reminded them of the moon. The general effect was the same: leaden disk, with slight prominences here and there on the circumference, and large irregular splotches of a darker shade relieved by a great many brilliantly lighted areas, lines, and spots. A second glance, however, found a marked difference. Instead of the craters which always distinguished the moon, Mercury showed ranges of bona fide mountains. The doctor gave a sigh of regret, mixed with a generous amount of excitement. "Too bad those mountains weren't distinguishable from the earth," he complained. "We wouldn't have been so quick to brand Mercury a dead world." The others were too engrossed to comment. The sky car was rapidly sinking nearer and nearer the planet. Already Smith had stopped the current with which he had attracted the cube toward the little world's northern hemisphere, and was now using negative voltage. This in order to act as a brake and prevent them from falling to destruction. Suddenly Von Emmen, the geologist, whose eyes had been glued to his binoculars, gave an exclamation of wonder. "Look at those faults!" He pointed to a region south of that for which they were bound, what might be called the planet's torrid zone. At first it was hard to see. Then, little by little, there unfolded before their eyes a giant spider-like system of chasms in the strange surface beneath them. From a point almost directly opposite the sun, these cracks radiated in a half-dozen different directions. Vast irregular clefts, they ran through mountain and plain alike. In places they must have been hundreds of miles wide, while there was no guessing as to their depth. For all that the four in the cube could see, they were bottomless. "Small likelihood of anybody being alive there now," commented the geologist skeptically. "If the sun has dried it out enough to produce faults like that, how could animal life exist?" "Notice, however," prompted the doctor, "that the cracks do not extend all the way to the edge of the disk." This was true. All the great chasms ended far short of the twilight band, which the doctor had declared might still contain life. But as the sky car rushed downward, their attention became fixed upon the surface directly beneath them, a point whose latitude corresponded roughly with that of New York on the earth. It was a region of low-lying mountains, decidedly different from various precipitous ranges to be seen to the north and east. On the west or left-hand side of this district, a comparatively level stretch, with an occasional peak or two projecting, suggested the ancient bed of an ocean. By this time they were within 1,000 miles. Smith threw on a little more current. Their speed diminished to a safer point, and they scanned the approaching surface with the greatest of care. The architect, who was a New Yorker, was strongly reminded of the fall aspect of the Appalachians, but Van Emmen, who was born and raised on the Pacific coast, declared that the spot was almost exactly like the region north of San Francisco. "If I didn't know where I was," he declared, "I'd be trying to locate Eureka right now." The engineer smiled tolerantly. He had spent several years in Scotland, and he felt sure, he obligingly told the others, that this new locality was far more like the Ben Lomond country than any other spot on earth. He was so positive he made the doctor, a New Zealander, smile quite broadly. "It is just like the hills near my home," he stated, with an air of finality which made further discussion useless. "There's a river!" the architect suddenly exclaimed, pointing, then added before the others could comment, "I mean what was once a river." They saw that he was right. An irregular but well-defined streak of sandy hue trickled down the middle of their chosen location, a long L-shaped valley surrounded by low hills. "That's the most likely place outside of the twilight zone for life to be found," remarked the doctor. "Neither mountainous nor dead level." He added, "The spectroscope has plainly shown that there's water vapor in what little air there is. Must be precious little. If the air was as humid as the earth's, we couldn't see the surface at all from this height." The inviting-looking valley was now less than 100 miles below. Inviting, however, only in outline. In color it was a grayish-buff, scorched and forbidding. The hills were yellower, and an alkali white on their summits. "Do either of you fellows see anything green?" demanded the engineer a little later. They were silent. Each had noticed long before that not even near the poles was there the slightest sign of vegetation. "No chance unless there's foliage," muttered the doctor half to himself. The builder asked what he meant. He explained. "So far as we know, all animal life depends upon vegetation for its oxygen. Not only the oxygen in the air, but that stored in the plants which animals eat. Unless there's greenery—" He paused at a low exclamation from Smith. The engineer's eyes were fixed in wonder and excitement upon that part of the valley which lay at the point of the L below them. It was perhaps 6 miles across, and all over the comparatively smooth surface jutted dark projections. Viewed through the glasses, they had a regular uniform appearance. "By Jove!" ejaculated the doctor, almost in awe. He leaned forward and scrubbed the deadlight for the 10th time. All four men strained their eyes to see. It was the architect who broke the silence which followed. The other three were content to let the thrill of the thing have its way with them. Such a feeling had little weight with the expert in archaeology. "Well," he declared jubilantly in his boyish voice, "either I eat my hat or that's a genuine bona fide city." As swiftly as an elevator drops, and as safely, the cube shot straight downward. Every second the landscape narrowed and shrunk, leaving the remaining details larger, clearer, sharper. Bit by bit, the amazing thing below them resolved itself into a real metropolis. Within 5 minutes they were less than a mile above it. Smith threw on more current, so that the descent stopped, and the cube hung motionless in space. For another 5 minutes the four men studied the scene in nervous silence. Each knew that the others were looking for the same thing, some sign of life. A little spot of green, or perhaps something in motion. A single whiff of smoke would have been enough to cause a whoop of joy. But nobody shouted. There was nothing to shout about. Nowhere in all that locality apparently was there the slightest indication that any save themselves were alive. Instead, the most extraordinary city that man had ever laid eyes upon was stretched directly beneath. It was grouped about what seemed to be the meeting point of three great roads, which led to this spot from as many passes through the surrounding hills. And the city seemed thus naturally divided into three segments, of equal size and shape, and each with its own street system. For they undoubtedly were streets. No metropolis on earth ever had its blocks laid out with such unvarying exactness. This Mercurian city contained none but perfectly equilateral triangles, and the streets themselves were of absolutely uniform width. The buildings, however, showed no such uniformity. On the outskirts of this brilliantly tan mystery, the blocks seemed to contain nothing save odd heaps of dingy, sun-baked mud. On the extreme north, however, lay 5 blocks grouped together, whose buildings, like those in the middle of the city, were rather tall, square-cut, and of the same dusty, cream-white hue. Downtown were several structures especially prominent for their height. They towered to such an extent, in fact, that their upper windows were easily made out. Apparently they were hundreds of stories high. Here and there on the streets could be seen small spots, colored a darker buff than the rest of that dazzling landscape, but not one of the spots was moving. "We'll go down further," said the engineer tentatively in a low tone. There was no comment. He gradually reduced the repelling current, so that the sky car resumed its descent. They sank down until they were on a level with the top of one of those extraordinary skyscrapers. The roof seemed perfectly flat, except for a large, round, black opening in its center. No one was in sight. When opposite the upper row of windows, at a distance of perhaps 20 feet, Smith brought the car to a halt, and they peered in. There were no panes. The windows opened directly onto a vast room, but nothing was clearly visible in the blackness, save the outlines of the opening on the opposite walls. They went down further, keeping well to the middle of the space above the street. At every other yard they kept a sharp lookout for the inhabitants, but so far as they could see their approach was entirely unobserved. When within 50 yards of the surface, all four men made a search for cross wires below. They saw none. There were no poles, even. Neither, to their astonishment, was there such a thing as a sidewalk. The street stretched, unbroken by curbing, from wall to wall and from corner to corner. As the cube settled slowly to the ground, the adventurers left the dead light to use the windows. For a moment the view was obscured by a swirl of dust, raised by the spurt of the current. Then this cloud vanished, settling to the ground with astonishing suddenness, as though jerked down by some invisible hand. Directly ahead of them, distance perhaps 100 yards, lay a yellowish-brown mass of unusual octagonal shape. One end contained a small oval opening, but the men from the earth looked in vain for any creature to emerge from it. The doctor silently set to work with his apparatus. From an air-tight double-doored compartment he obtained a sample of the ether outside the car, and with the aid of previously arranged chemicals quickly learned the truth. There was no air. Not only was there no oxygen, the element upon which all known life depends, but there was no nitrogen, no carbon dioxide, not the slightest trace of water vapor or of the other less-known elements which can be found in small amounts in our own atmosphere. Clearly, as the doctor said, whatever air the astronomers had observed must exist on the circumference of the planet only, and not in this sun-blasted north-central spot. On the outer walls of the cube, so arranged as to be visible through the windows, were various instruments. The barometer showed no pressure. The thermometer, a specially devised one which used gas instead of mercury, showed a temperature of 600 degrees Fahrenheit. No air, no water, and a baking heat. As the geologists remark, how could life exist there? But the architect suggested that possibly there was some form of life, of which men knew nothing, which could exist under such circumstances. They got out 3 of the suits. They were a good deal like those worn by divers, except that the outer layer was made of non-conducting aluminum cloth, flexible, airtight, and strong. Between it and the inner lining was a layer of cells, into which the men now pumped several pints of liquid oxygen. The terrific cold of this chemical made the heavy flannel of the inner lining very welcome, while the oxygen itself, as fast as it evaporated, revitalized the air within the big, glass-faced helmet. Once safely locked within the clumsy suits, Jackson, Van Emmon, and Smith took their places within the vestibule, while the doctor, who had volunteered to stay behind, watched them open the outer door. With a hiss, all the air in the vestibule rushed out, and the doctor earnestly thanked his stars that the inner door had been built very strongly. The men stepped out onto the ground. At first they moved with great care, being uncertain that their feet were weighted heavily enough to counteract the reduced gravitation of the tiny planet. But they had been living in a very peculiar condition, gravitationally speaking, for the past 3 days, and they quickly adapted themselves. After a little shifting about, the 3 artificial monsters gave their telephone wires another scrutiny. Then, keeping always within 10 feet of each other, so as not to throw any strain on the connections, they strode in a matter-of-fact way toward the nearest doorway. For a moment or two they stood outside the queer, peaked archway, their glimmering suits standing out oddly in the blinding sunlight. Then they advanced boldly into the opening. In a flash they vanished from the doctor's sight, and the ink-like blackness of the opening again stared at him from that dazzling wall. End of Section 2. Recorded by Jennifer Wigginton.
Section 3 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ryan Lothian. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Ian Flint. Part 1. The Discovery. Chapter 3. The House of Dust. The geologist, strong man that he was, and by profession an investigator of the unknown, Van Emmon, took the lead. He stalked straight away into a vast space, which, without any preliminary hallway, filled the entire triangular block. Before their eyes were accustomed to the shadow, "Pretty cold," murmured the architect into the phone transmitter. It was fastened to the inside of the helmet, directly in front of his mouth, while the receiver was placed beside his ear. All 3 stopped short to adjust each other's electrical heating apparatus. To do this they did not use their fingers directly. They manipulated ingenious non-magnetic pliers attached to the ends of fingerless insulated mittens. Before they had finished, the builder, who had been puzzling over the extraordinary suddenness with which the cloud of dust had settled, received an inspiration. He was carrying notebook and camera. With his pliers he tore out a sheet from the former, and holding book in one hand and the leaf in the other, he allowed them to drop at the same instant. They reached the ground together. "See?" The architect repeated the experiment. "Back home, where there's air, the paper would have floated down. It would have taken 3 times as long for it to fall as the book." Smith nodded, but he had been thinking of something else. He said gravely, "Remember what I told you. It's the air that insulates the earth from the ether. If there's no air here," he glanced out into the pitiless sunlight, "then I hope there's no flaw in our insulation. We're walking in an electrical bath." They looked around. Objects were pretty distant now. They could easily see that the floor was covered with what appeared to be machines, laid out in orderly fashion. Here, however, as outside, Everything was covered with that fine, cream-coloured dust. It filled every nook and cranny. It stirred about their feet with every step. The geologist led the way down a broad aisle, on either side of which towered immense machinery. Smith was for stopping to examine them one by one, but the others vetoed the engineer's passion, and strode on towards the end of the triangle. More than anything else, they looked for the absent population to show itself. Suddenly Van Emmon stopped short. "Is it possible that they're all asleep?" He added that, even though the sun shone steadily the year round, the people must take some time off for rest. But Smith stirred the dust with his foot and shook his head. "I've seen no tracks. This dust has been lying here for weeks, perhaps months. If the folks are away, they must be taking a community vacation." At the end of the aisle they reached a small, railed-in space, strongly resembling what might have been seen in any office on earth. In the middle of it stood a low, flat-topped desk, for all the world like that of a prosperous real estate agent, except that it was half a foot lower. There was no chair. For lack of a visible gate in the railing, the explorers stepped over, being careful not to touch it. There was nothing on top of the desk, save the usual coat of dust. Below, a very wide space had been left for the legs of whoever had used it, and flanking this space were two pedestals, containing what looked to be a multitude of exceedingly small drawers. Smith bent and examined them. Apparently they had no locks, and he unhesitatingly reached out, gripped the knob of one, and pulled. Noiselessly, instantaneously, the whole desk crumbled to powder. Startled, Smith stumbled backwards, knocking against the railing. Next instant it lay on the floor, its fragments scarcely distinguishable from what had already covered the surface. Only a tiny cloud of dust arose, and in half a second this had settled. The three looked at each other significantly. Clearly, the thing that had just happened argued a great lapse of time since the user of that desk officiated in that enclosure. It looked as though Smith's guess of weeks, perhaps months, would have to be changed to years, perhaps centuries. "Feel all right?" asked the geologist. Jackson and Smith made affirmative noises, and again they stepped out, this time walking in the aisle along the outer wall. They could see their sky car plainly through the ovals. Here the machinery could be examined more closely. "They resembled automatic testing scales," said Smith, "such as is used in weighing complicated metal products after finishing and assembling. Moreover, they seemed to be connected, the one to the other, with a series of endless belts, which Smith thought indicated automatic production. To all appearances, the dust-covered apparatus stood just as it had been left when operations ceased an unguessable length of time before." Smith showed no desire to touch the things now. Seeing this, the geologist deliberately reached out and scraped the dust from the nearest machine, and to the relief of all three, no damage was done. The dust fell straight to the floor, exposing a brilliantly polished streak of greenish-white metal. Van Emmon made another tentative brush or so at the points, with the same result. Clean, untarnished metal lay beneath all that dust. Clearly it was some non-conducting alloy. Whatever it was, it had successfully resisted the action of the elements all the while that such presumably wooden articles as the desk and railing had been steadily rotting. Emboldened, Smith clambered up the frame of one of the machines. He examined it closely as to its cams, clutches, gearing, and other details significant enough to his mechanical training. He noted their adjustments, scrutinized the conveying apparatus, and came back carrying a cylindrical object which he had removed from an automatic chuck. "This is what they were making," he remarked, trying to conceal his excitement. The others brushed the dust from the thing, a huge piece of metal which would have been too much for their strength on Earth. Instantly they identified it. It was a cannon shell. Again Van Emmon led the way. They took a reassuring glance out the window at the familiar cube, then passed along the aisle towards the farther corner. As they neared it, they saw that it contained a small enclosure of heavy metal scrollwork. within which stood a triangular elevator. The men examined it as closely as possible, noting especially the extremely low stool which stood upon its platform. The same unerodable metal seemed to have been used throughout the whole affair. After a careful scrutiny of the two levers which appeared to control the thing, "I'm going to try it out," announced Smith, well knowing that the others would have to go with him if they kept the telephones intact. They protested that the thing was not safe. Smith replied that they had seen no stairway or anything corresponding to one. "If this lift is made of that alloy," admiringly, "then it's safe." But Jackson managed to talk him out of it. When they returned to the heap of powdered wood which had been the desk, Smith spied a long workbench under a nearby window. There they found a very ordinary vise in which was clamped a piece of metal. But for the dust, it might have been placed there 10 minutes before. On the bench lay several tools, some familiar to the engineer, and some entirely strange. A set of screwdrivers of various sizes caught his eye. He picked them up, and again experienced the sensation of having wood turn to dust at his touch. The blades were whole. Still searching, the engineer found a square metal chest of drawers, each of which he promptly opened. The contents were laden with dust, but he brushed this off and disclosed a quantity of exceedingly delicate instruments. They were more like dentists' tools than machinists', yet plainly were intended for mechanical use. One drawer held what appeared to be a roll of drawings. Smith did not want to touch them. With infinite care he blew off the dust with the aid of his oxygen pipe. After a moment or two the surface was clear, but it offered no encouragement. It was the blank side of the paper. There was no help for it. Smith grasped the roll firmly with his pliers, and next second gazed upon dust. In the bottom drawer lay something that aroused the curiosity of all three. These were small reels, about 2 inches in diameter and 1/4 of an inch thick, each encased in a tight-fitting box. They resembled measuring tapes to some extent, except that the ribbons were made of marvellously thin material. Van Emmon guessed that there were 100 yards in a roll. Smith estimated it at 300. They seemed to be made of metal similar to that composing the machines. Smith pocketed them all. It was the builder who thought to look under the bench, but it was Smith who had brought a light. By its aid they discovered a very small machine, decidedly like a stock ticker, except that it had no glass dome, but possessed at one end a curious metal disc about 1 foot in diameter. Apparently it had been undergoing repairs. It was impossible to guess its purpose. Smith's pride was instantly aroused. He tucked it under his arm, and was impatient to get back to the cube, where he might more carefully examine his finds with the tips of his fingers. It was when they were about to leave the building that they thought to inspect walls and ceiling. Not that anything worth while was to be seen. The surfaces seemed perfectly plain and bare, except for the inevitable dust. Even the uppermost corners, 10 feet above their heads, showed dust to the light of Smith's electric torch. Van Emmon stopped and stared at the spots, as though fascinated. The others were ready to go. They turned and looked at him curiously. For a moment or two he seemed struggling for breath. "Good heavens!" he gasped, almost in a whisper. His face was white. The other two leaped toward him, fearful that he was suffocating, but he pushed them away roughly. "We're fools! Blind, blithering idiots, that's what we are!" He pointed toward the ceiling with a hand that trembled plainly, and went on in a voice which he tried to make fierce despite the awe which shook it. "Look at that dust again. How'd it get there?" He paused while the others, the thought finally getting to them, felt a queer chill striking at the back of their necks. "Men, there's only one way for the dust to settle on a wall. It's got to have air to carry it. It couldn't possibly get there without air. That dust settled long before life appeared on Earth even. It's been there ever since the air disappeared from Mercury." End of chapter 3. Recording by Ryan Lothian.
Section 4. of the Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 1, The Discovery. Chapter 4, The Library. "I thought you'd never get back," complained the doctor crossly when the three entered. They had been gone just half an hour. Next moment he was studying their faces, and at once he demanded the most important fact. They told him, and before they had finished he was halfway into another suit. He was all eagerness, but somehow the three were very glad to be inside the cube again, and firmly insisted upon moving to another spot before making further explorations. Within a minute or two the cube was hovering opposite the upper floor of the building the three had entered, and with only a foot of space separating the window of the sky car and the dust-covered wall, the men from the earth inspected the interior at considerable length. They flashed a searchlight all about the place, and concluded that it was the receiving room, where the raw iron billets were brought via the elevator, and from there slid to the floor below. At one end, in exactly the same location as the desk Smith had destroyed, stood another, with a low and remarkably broad chair beside it. So far as could be seen, there were neither doors, window panes, nor shutters through the structure. "To get all the light and air they could," guessed the doctor. "Perhaps that's why the buildings are all triangular, most wall surface in proportion to floor area that way." A few hundred feet higher they began to look for prominent buildings. Only in forgetful moments did either of them scan the landscape for signs of life. They knew now that there could be none. "We ought to learn something there," the doctor said after a while, pointing out a particularly large, squat, irregularly built affair on the edge of the business district. The architect, however, was in favor of an exceptionally large, high building in the isolated group previously noted in the suburbs. But because it was nearer, they maneuvered first in the direction of the doctor's choice. The sky car came to rest in a large plaza, opposite what appeared to be the structure's main entrance. From their window the explorers saw that the squat effect was due only to the space the edifice covered, for it was an edifice, a full 5 stories high. The doctor was impatient to go. Smith was willing enough to stay behind. He was already joyously examining the strange machine he had found. 2 minutes later, Kinney, Van Emmon, and Jackson were standing before the portals of the great building. There they halted, and no wonder. The entire face of the building could now be seen to be covered with a mass of carvings. For the most part they were statues in bas relief. All were fantastic in the extreme, but whether purposely so or not there was no way to tell. Certainly any such work on the part of an earthly artist would have branded him either as insane or as an incomprehensible genius. Directly above the entrance was a group which might have been labeled "The Triumph of the Brute." An enormously powerful man, nearly as broad as he was tall, stood exulting over his victim, a less robust figure, prostrate under his feet. Both were clad in armor. The victor's face was distorted into a savage snarl, startlingly hideous by reason of the prodigious size of his head, planted as it was directly upon his shoulders, for he had no neck. His eyes were set so close together that at first glance they seemed to be but one. His nose was flat and African in type, while his mouth, devoid of curves, was simply revolting in its huge, thick-lipped lack of proportion. His chin was square and aggressive, his forehead, strangely enough, extremely high and narrow, rather than low and broad. His victim lay in an attitude that indicated the most agonizing torture. His head was bent completely back and around behind his shoulders. On the ground lay 2 battle axes, huge affairs, almost as heavy as the massively muscled men who had used them. But the eyes of the explorers kept coming back to the fearsome face of the conqueror. From the brows down, he was simply a huge, brutal giant. Above his eyes, he was an intellectual. The combination was absolutely frightful. The beast looked capable of anything, of overcoming any obstacle, mental or physical, internal or external, in order to assert his apparently enormous will. He could control himself or dominate others with equal ease and assurance. "It can't be that he was drawn from life," said the doctor with an effort. It wasn't easy to criticize that figure, lifeless though it was. On a planet like this, with such slight gravitation, there's no need for such huge strength. The typical Mercurian should be tall and flimsy in build rather than short and compact. But the geologist differed. "We want to remember that the earth has no standard type. Think what a difference there is between the mosquito and the elephant, the snake and the spider. One would suppose that they had been developed under totally different planetary conditions, instead of all right on the same globe. No, I think this monster may have been genuine." And with that the geologist turned to examine the other statuary. Without exception it resembled the central group. All the figures were neckless, and all much more heavily built than any people on earth. There were several female figures. They had the same general build, and in every case were so placed as to enhance the glory of the males. In one group the woman was offering up food and drink to a resting worker. In another she was being carried off, struggling, in the arms of a fairly good-looking warrior. Dr. Kinney led the way into the building. As in the other structure, there was no door. The space seemed to be but 1 story in height, although that had the effect of a cathedral. The whole of the ceiling, irregularly arched in a curious pointed manner, was ornamented with grotesque figures, while the walls were also partially formed of squat, semi-human statues, set upon huge triangular shafts. In the spaces between these outlandish pilasters there had once been some sort of decorations. A great many photos were taken here. As for the floor, it was divided in all directions by low walls. About 5½ feet in height, these walls separated the great room into perhaps 100 triangular compartments, each about the size of an ordinary living room. Broad openings, about 5 feet square, provided free access from one compartment to any other. The men from the earth, by standing on tiptoes, could see over and beyond this system. "Wonder if these walls were supposed to cut off the view," speculated the doctor. "I mean, do you suppose that the Mercurians were such short people as that?" His question had to go unanswered. They stepped into the nearest compartment, and were all on the point of pronouncing it bare, when Jackson, with an exclamation, excitedly brushed away some of the dust and showed that the presumably solid walls were really chests of drawers. Shallow things of that peculiar metal, these drawers numbered several hundred to the compartment. In the whole building there must have been millions. Once more the dust was carefully removed, revealing a layer of those curious rolls or reels, exactly similar to what had been found in the tool chest in the shell works. A careful examination of the metallic tape showed nothing whatever to the naked eye, although the doctor fancied that he made out some strange characters on the little boxes themselves. His view was shortly proved. Finding drawer after drawer to contain a similar display, varying from 1 to a dozen of the diminutive ribbons, Van Emmon adopted the plan of gently blowing away the dust from the faces of the drawers before opening them. This revealed the fact that each of the shallow things was neatly labeled. Instantly the three were intent upon their fresh clue. The markings were very faint and delicate, the slightest touch being enough to destroy them. To the untrained eye they resembled ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. To the archaeologist they meant that a brand new system of ideographs had been found. Suddenly Jackson straightened up and looked about with a new interest. He went to one of the square doorways and very carefully removed the dust from a small plate on the lintel. He need not have been so careful. Engraved in the solid metal was a single character, plainly in the same language as the other ideographs. The architect smiled triumphantly into the inquiring eyes of his friends. "I won't have to eat my hat," said he. "This is a sure enough city, all right, and this is the library." Smith was still busy on the little machine when they returned to the cube. He said that one part of it had disappeared and was busily engaged in filing a bit of steel to take its place. As soon as it was ready he thought they could see what the apparatus meant. The three had brought a large number of the reels. They were confident that a microscopic search of the ribbons would disclose something to bear out Jackson's theory that the great structure was really a repository for books, or whatever corresponded with books on Mercury. "But the main thing," said the doctor enthusiastically, "is to get over to the Twilight Band. I'm beginning to have all sorts of wild hopes." Jackson urged that they first visit the big mansion on the outskirts of this place. He said he felt sure, somehow, that it would be worth while. But Van Emmon backed up the doctor, and the architect had to be content with an agreement to return in case their trip was futile. Inside of a few minutes the cube was being drawn steadily over toward the left or western edge of the planet's sunlit face. As it moved, all except Smith kept close watch on the ground below. They made out town after town, as well as separate buildings, and on the roads were to be seen a great many of those octagonal structures, all motionless. After several hundred miles of this, the surface abruptly sloped toward what had clearly been the bed of an ocean. No sign of habitations here, however, so apparently the water had disappeared after the humans had gone. The ancient sea ended a short distance from the district they were seeking. A little more travel brought them to a point where the sun cast as much shadow as light on the surface. It was here they descended, coming to rest on a sunlit knoll which overlooked a small, building-filled valley. According to Kinney's apparatus, there was about 1/40th the amount of air that exists on the earth. Of water vapor there was a trace, but all their search revealed no human life. Not only that, but there was no trace of lower animals. There was not even a lizard, much less a bird, and even the most ancient-looking of the sculptures showed no creatures of the air. Only huge antediluvian monsters were ever depicted. They took a great many photos as a matter of course. Also, they investigated some of the big octagonal machines in the streets, finding them to be similar to the great tanks that were used in the war, except that they did not have the characteristic caterpillar tread. Their 8 faces were so linked together that the entire affair could roll, after a jolting, slab-sided flopping fashion. Inside were curious engines and sturdy machines designed to throw the cannon shells they had seen. No explosive was employed, apparently, but centrifugal force generated in whirling wheels. Apparently these cars or chariots were universally used. The explorers returned to the cube, where they found that Smith, happening to look out a window, had spied a pond not far off. The three visited it and found on its banks the first green stuff they had seen, a tiny, flowerless salt grass, very scarce. It bordered a slimy, bluish pool of absolutely still fluid. Nobody would call it water. They took a few samples of it and went back. And within a few minutes the doctor slid a small glass slide into his microscope and examined the object with much satisfaction. What he saw was a tiny, gelatin-like globule. Among scientists it is known as the amoeba. It is the simplest known form of life, the so-called single cell. It had been the first thing to live on that planet, and apparently it was also the last. End of chapter 4. Section 5 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 1. The Discovery. Chapter 5. The Closed Door. As they neared Jackson's pet mansion, each man paid close attention to the intervening blocks. For the most part these were simply shapeless ruins, heaps of what had once been, perhaps brick or stone. Once they allowed the cube to rest on the top of one of these mounds, but the sky car's great weight merely sank it into the mass. There was nothing under it save the same sandy dust. Apparently the locality they were approaching had been set aside as a very exclusive residence district for the elite of the country. Perhaps it contained the homes of the royalty, assuming that there had been a royalty, At any rate, the conspicuous structure Jackson had selected was certainly the home of the most important member of that colony. When the three, once more in their helmets and suits, stood before the low, broad portico that protected the entrance to that edifice, the first thing they made out was an ornamental frieze running across the face. In the same bold, realistic style as the other sculpture, there was depicted a hand-to-hand battle between two groups of those half-savage, half-cultured monstrosities, and in the background was shown a glowing orb, obviously the sun. "See that!" exclaimed the doctor. "The size of that sun! I mean, compare it with the way old Sol looks now." They took a single glance at the great ball of fire over their heads. 9 times the size it always seemed at home. It contrasted sharply with the rather small ball shown in the carvings. "Understand," the doctor went on, "when that sculpture was made, Mercury was a little nearer the sun than the earth is now." The builder was hugely impressed. He asked eagerly, "Then probably the people became as highly developed as we?" Van Emmon nodded approvingly, but the doctor opposed. "No, I think not, Jackson. Mercury never did have as much air as the earth, and consequently had much less oxygen. And the struggle for existence," he went on, watching to see if the geologist approved each point as he made it, "the struggle for life is, in the last analysis, a struggle for oxygen. So I would say that life was a pretty strenuous proposition here while it lasted. Perhaps they were—" He stopped, then added, "What I can't understand is, how did it happen that their affairs came to such an abrupt end? And why don't we see any, indications?" "Skeletons," the architect shuddered. Next second, though, his face lit up with a thought. "I remember reading that electricity will decompose bone in time." And then he shuddered again as his foot stirred that lifeless, impalpable dust. Was it possible? As they passed into the great house, the first thing they noted was the floor, undivided, dust-covered, and bare, except for what had perhaps been rugs. The shape was the inevitable equilateral triangle, and there, with a certain magnificent disregard for precedent, the builders had done away with a ceiling entirely, and instead had sloped the three walls up till they met in a single point 100 feet overhead. The effect was massively simple. In one corner a section of the floor was elevated, perhaps 3 feet above the rest, and directly back of this was a broad doorway set in a short wall. The three advanced at once toward it. Here the electric torch came in very handy. It disclosed a poorly lighted stairway, very broad, unrailed, and preposterously steep. The steps were each over 3 feet high. "Different in gravitation," said the doctor in response to Jackson's questioning look. "Easy enough for the old-timers, perhaps." They struggled up the flight as best they could, reaching the top after over 5 minutes of climbing. Perhaps it was the reaction from this exertion. At all events, each felt a distinct loss of confidence as, after regaining their wind, they again began to explore. Neither said anything about it to the others, but each noted a queer sense of foreboding, far more disquieting than either of them had felt when investigating anything else. It may have been due to the fact that in their hurry they had not stopped to eat. The floor they were on was fairly well lighted with the usual oval windows. The space was open, except that it contained the same kind of dividing walls they had found in the library. Here, however, each compartment contained but one opening, and that not uniformly placed. In fact, as the three noted with a growing uneasiness, it was necessary to pass through every one of them in order to reach the corner farthest from the ladder-like stairs. Why it should make them uneasy, neither could have said. When they were almost through the labyrinth, Van Emmon, after standing on tiptoes for the 10th time in order to locate himself, noted something that had escaped their attention before. "These compartments used to be covered over," he said, for some reason lowering his voice. He pointed out niches in the wall, such as undoubtedly once held the ends of heavy timbers. "What was this place, anyhow? A trap?" Unconsciously, they lightened their steps as they neared the last compartment. They found, as expected, that it was another stairwell. Van Emmon turned the light upon every corner of the place before going any further, but except for a formless heap of rubbish in one corner, which they did not investigate, the place was as bare as the rest of the floor. Again they climbed, this time for a much shorter distance, but Jackson, slightly built chap that he was, needed a little help on the steep stairs. They were not sorry that they had reached the uppermost floor of the mansion. It was somewhat better lighted than the floor below, and they were relieved to find that the triangular compartments did not have the significant niches in their walls. Their spirits rose perceptibly. At the corner farthest from the stairs, one of the walls rose straight to the ceiling, completely cutting off a rather large triangle. The three paid no attention to the other compartments, but went straight to what they felt sure was the most vital spot in the place. And their feelings were justified with a vengeance when they saw that the usual doorway in this wall was protected by something they had so far been entirely missing everywhere else. It was barred by a heavy door. For several minutes the doctor, the geologist, and the architect stood before it. Neither would have liked to admit that he would just as soon leave that door unopened. All the former uneasiness came back. It was all the more inexplicable, with the brilliant sunlight only a few feet away, that each should have felt chilled by the place. "Wonder if it's locked," remarked Van Emmon. He pressed against the dust-covered barrier, half expecting it to turn to dust, but evidently it had been made of the time-defying alloy. It stood firm, and to all appearances it was nearly airtight. "Well," said the doctor suddenly, so that the other two started nervously, "the door's got to come down, that's all." They looked around. There was no furniture, no loose piece of material of any kind. Van Emmon straightway backed away from the door about 6 feet, and the others followed his example. "All together," grunted the geologist, and the three aluminum-armored monsters charged the door. It shook under the impact. A shower of dust fell down, and they saw that they had loosened the thing. "Once more." This time a wide crack showed all around the edge of the door, and the third attempt finished the job. Noiselessly, for there was no air to carry the sound, but with a heavy jar which all three felt through their feet, the barrier went flat on the floor beyond. At the same instant a curious, invisible wave, like a tiny puff of wind, floated out of the darkness and passed by the three men from the earth. Each noticed it, but neither mentioned it at the time. Van Emmon was already searching the darkness with the torch. Apparently it was only an anteroom. A few feet beyond was another wall, and in it stood another door, larger and heavier than the first. The three did not stop. They immediately tried their strength on this one also. After a half-dozen attempts without so much as shaking the massive affair, "It's no use," panted the geologist, wishing that he could get a handkerchief to his forehead. "We can't loosen it without tools." Jackson was for trying again, but the doctor agreed with Van Emmon. They reflected that they had been away from Smith long enough, anyhow. The cube was out of sight from where they were. Van Emmon turned the light on the walls of the anteroom, and found on a shelf at one end a neat pile of those little reels, 11 in all. He pocketed the lot. There was nothing else. Jackson and Kinney started to go. They retreated as far into the main room as their telephone wires would allow. Still the geologist held back. "Come on," said the doctor uneasily. "It's getting cold." Next second they stopped short, nerves on edge, at a strange exclamation from Van Emmon. They looked around to see him pointing his light directly at the floor. Even in that unnatural suit of mail, his attitude was one of horror. "Look here," he said in a low, strained voice. They went to his side and instinctively glanced behind them before looking at what lay in the dust. It was the imprint of an enormous human foot. The first thing that greeted the ears of the explorers, upon taking off their suits in the sky car, was the exultant voice of Smith. He was too excited to notice anything out of the way in their manner. He was almost dancing in front of his bench, where the unknown machine, now reconstructed, stood belted to a small electric motor. "It runs!" he was shouting. "You got here just in time." He began to fumble with a switch. "What of it?" remarked the doctor in a bland tone, which he kept for occasions when Smith needed calming. "What will it do if it runs?" The engineer looked blank. "Why—" Then he remembered and picked up one of the reels at random. "There's a clamp here just the right size to hold one of these," he explained, fitting the ribbon into place, and threading its free end into a loop on the spool which looked as though made for it. But his excitement had passed. He now cautiously set a small anvil between himself and the apparatus, and then, with the aid of a long stick, he threw on the current. For a moment nothing happened save the hum of the motor. Then a strange, leafy rustling sounded from the mechanism, and next, without any warning, a high-pitched voice, nasal and plaintive but distinctly human, spoke from the big metal disc. The words were unintelligible. The language was totally unlike anything ever heard on the earth. And yet, deliberately, if somewhat cringingly, the voice proceeded with what was apparently a recitation. There were modulations, pauses, sentences, but seemingly the paragraphs were all short and to the point. As the thing went on, the four men came closer and watched the operation of the machine. The ribbon unrolled slowly. It was plain that if the one topic occupied the whole reel, then it must have the length of an ordinary chapter. And as the voice continued, certain dramatic qualities came out and governed the words, utterly incomprehensible though they were. There was a real thrill to it. After a while they stopped the thing. "No use listening to this now," said the doctor. "We've got to learn a good deal more about these people before we can guess what it all means." And yet, although all were hungry, on Jackson's suggestion they tried out one of the records that was brought from the baffling anteroom. Smith was very much interested in that unopened door, and Van Emmon was in the midst of it when Jackson started the motor. The geologist's words stuck in his throat. The disc was actually shaking with the vibrations of a terrific voice, prodigiously loud and powerful. Its booming, resonant bass smote the ears like the roll of thunder. It was irresistible in its force, compelling in its assurance, masterful and strong to an overpowering degree. Involuntarily, the men from the earth stepped back. On it roared and rumbled, speaking the same language as that of the other record, but whereas the first speaker merely used the words, the last speaker demolished them. One felt that he had extracted every ounce of power in the language, leaving it weak and flabby, unfit for further use. He threw out his sentences as though done with them, not boldly, not defiantly, least of all tentatively. He spoke with a certainty and force that came from a knowledge that he could compel rather than induce his hearers to believe. It took a little nerve to shut him off. Van Emmon was the one who did it. Somehow they all felt immensely relieved when the gigantic voice was silenced and at once began discussing the thing with great earnestness. Jackson was for assuming that the first record was worn and old, the last one fresh and new. But after examining both tapes under a glass and seeing how equally clear-cut and sharp the impressions all were, they agreed that the extraordinary voice they had heard was practically true to life. They tried out the rest of the records in the batch, finding that they were all by the same speaker. Nowhere among the ribbons brought from the library was another of his making, although a great number of different voices was included. Neither was there another talker with a fifth the volume, the resonance, the absolute power of conviction that this unknown colossus possessed. Of course, this is no place to describe the laborious process of interpreting these documents, records of a past which was gone before Earth's mankind had even begun. The work involved in the study of countless photos, covering everything from inscriptions to parts of machinery, and other details which furnished clue after clue to that super-ancient language. It was not deciphered, in fact, until several years after the explorers had submitted their finds to the world's foremost lexicographers, antiquarians, and paleontologists. Even today, some of it is disputed. But right here is, most emphatically, the place to insert the tale told by that unparalleled voice. And incredible though it may seem, as judged by the standards of the peoples of this earth, the account is fairly proved by the facts uncovered by the expedition. it would be but begging the question to doubt the genuineness of the thing. And if understanding the language one were to hear the original as it fell, word for word from the iron mouth of Strokor, footnote, translator's note. In the Mercurian language, stroke means iron or heart. The great hearing, one would believe, none could doubt, nor would. And so it does not do him justice to set it down in ordinary print. One must imagine the story being related by Stentor himself, must conceive of each word falling like the blow of a mammoth sledge. This tale was not told, it was bellowed. And this is how it ran. End of chapter 5.
Section 6 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Boyce. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 2, The Story. Chapter 1, The Man. I am Strokor, son of Strok the Armorer. I am Strokor, a maker of tools of war. Strokor, the mightiest man in the world. Strokor, whose wisdom outwitted the hordes of Clow. Strokor, who has never feared and never failed. Let him who dares dispute it. I am Strokor. In my youth I was as now, the marvel of all who saw. I was ever robust and daring, and naught but much older and bigger lads could outdo me. I balked at nothing, be it a game or a battle. It was, and forever shall be, my chief delight to best all others. 'Twas from my mother that I gained my huge frame and sound heart. In truth, I am very like her now that I think upon it. She too was indomitable in battle, and famed for her liking for strife. No doubt 'twas her stalwart figure that caught my father's fancy. Aye, my mother was a very likely woman, but she boasted no brains. I need no cunning, I remember she said, and he who was so unlucky in battle as to fall into her hands could vouch for the truth of it, as long as he lived, which would not be long. She was a grand woman, slow to anger, and a match for many a good pair of men. Often as a lad have I carried the marks of her punishment for the most of a year. And thus it seems that I owe my head to my father. He was a marvelously clever man, dexterous with hand and brain alike. Moreover, he was no weakling. Perchance I should credit him with some of my agility, for he was famed as a gymnast, though not a powerful one. 'Twas he who taught me how to disable my enemy with a mere clutch of the neck at a certain spot. But Strok the Armorer was feared more because of his brain, and his knack of using his mind to the undoing of others. And he taught me all that he knew. Taught me all that he had learned in a lifetime of fighting for the Emperor, of mending the complicated machines in the armory, of contact with the chemists who wrought the secret alloy, and the chiefs who led the army. Some of this he taught me when I was not yet a man. Why he should have done so, I know not, save that he seemed to value my affection, and like not my mother's demands that I heed her call, not his. At all events, I oft found his shop a place of refuge from her wrath, and I early came to value his teachings. When I became a man, he abruptly ended the practice. I think he saw that I was become as dexterous as he with the tools of the craft, and he feared lest I know more than he. Well he might. The day I realized this, I laughed long and loud, and from that time forth he taught me, not because he chose to, but because I bent a chisel in my bare hands before his eyes and told him his place. Many times he strove to trick me, and more than once he all but caught me in some trap. He was a crafty man, and relied not upon brawn, but upon wits. Yet I was ever on the watch, and I but learned the more from him. "Ye are very kind," I mocked him one morning. When I had taken my seat, a huge weight had dropped from above and crushed my stool to splinters, much as it would have crushed my skull had I not leapt instantly aside. "Ye are kinder than most fathers, who teach their sons nothing at all." He foamed at his mouth in his rage and discomfiture. "Insolent whelp," he snarled, "thou art quick as a cat on thy feet." But I was not appeased by words. I smote him on the chest with my bare hand, so that he fell on the far side of the room. "Let that be a warning," I told him, when he had recovered some time later. "If ye have any more tricks, try them for, not on me," which I claim to be a neat twist of words. It was not long after that when I saw a change in my father. He no longer tried to snare me. Instead, he began, of his own free will, to train my mind to other than warlike things. At first I was suspicious enough. I looked for new traps, and watched all the closer. I told him that his next try would surely be his last, and I meant it. But the time came when I saw that my father was reconciled to his master. I saw that he genuinely admitted my prowess, and where he formerly envied me, he now took great pride in all I accomplished, and claimed that it was but his own brains acting through my body. I let him indulge in the conceit. I grudged it not to him, so long as he taught me. In truth, he was so eager to add to my store of facts, so intent upon filling my head with what filled his, that at times I was fairly compelled to stop him, lest I tire. My mother opposed all this. "The lad needs none of thy wiles," she gibed. "He is no stripling. He is a man's man, and a fit son of his mother." "Ay," quoth my father slightly, "he hath thy muscles and thy courage. Thank John, he hath not thy empty head." Whereat she flew at him. Had she caught him, she would have destroyed him, such was her rage. And afterward she would have mourned her folly, and mayhap have injured herself, for she loved him greatly. But he stepped aside just in the nick of time, and she crashed into the wall behind him with such force that she was senseless for a time. I remember it well. And yet, to give credit where credit is due, I must admit that I owe a great deal to that greybeard Maka the Stargazer. But for him, perchance, the name of Strokor would mean but little, for 'twas he who gave me ambition. Truly, it was an uncommon affair, my first meeting with him. Now that I shake my memory for it, it seems that something else of like consequence came to pass on the same occasion. Curious, but I have not thought on it for many days. Yes, it is true. I met Maka on the very morn that I first laid eyes on the girl Ave. I was returning from the Northland at the time. A rumor had come down to Vlama that one of the people in the snow country had seen a lone specimen of the Mulika. Now these were but a myth. No man living remembers when the carving on the House of Learning were made, and all the wise men say that it hath been ages since any being other than man roamed the world. Yet I was young. I determined to search for the thing anyhow, and 'twas only after wasting many days in the snow that I cursed my luck and turned back. I was afoot, for the going was too rough for my chariot. I had not yet quit the wilderness before, from a height, I spied a group of people ascending from the valley. Knowing not whether they be friends or foes, I hid behind the path up which they must come, for I was weary and wanting no strife. Yet I became alert enough when the three, they were 2 ditch tenders, one old, one young, and a girl, came within earshot. For they were quarreling. It seemed that the young man, who was plainly eager to gain the girl, had fouled in a try to force her favor. The older man chided him hotly. And just when they came opposite my rock, the younger man, whose passion had got the better of him, suddenly tripped the older, so that he fell upon the ledge, and would have fallen to his death on the rocks below, had not the girl, crying out in her terror, leapt forward and caught his hand. At once the ditch tender took the lass about the waist, and strove to pull her away. For a moment she held fast, and in that moment I, Strokor, came forth from behind the rock. Now be it known that I am no champion of weaklings. I have no liking for the troubles of others. Enough of my own, say I. I was but angered that the ditch tender should have done the trick so clumsily, and upon an old man at that. I cared not for the greybeard, nor what became of the chit. I clapped the trickster upon the shoulder, and spun him about. "Ye clumsy coward," I jeered, "have ye had no practice, that ye should trip the old one no better than that?" "Who are ye?" he stuttered, like the coward he was. I laughed, and helped the chit drag Maka, for it was he up to safety. "I am a far better man than ye," I said, not caring to give my name, "and I can show ye how the thing should be done. Come at me, if ye are a man." At that he dashed upon me, and such was his fear of ridicule, for the girl was laughing him to scorn now, he put up a fair, stiff fight. But I forgot my weariness, when he foully clotted me on the head with a stone. I drove at him with all the speed and suddenness my father had taught me, caught the fellow by the ankle, and brought him down atop me. The rest was easy. I bent my knee under his middle and tossed him high. In a flash I was upon my feet and caught him from behind, and in another second I had rushed him to the cliff. And when he turned to save himself, I tripped him as neatly as father himself could have done it, so that the fellow will guard the ditch no more, save in the caverns of Hof. I laughed and picked up my pack. My head hurt a bit from the fellow's blow, but a little water would do for that. I started to go. "Ye are a brave man!" cried the girl. I turned carelessly, and then, quite for the first time, I had a real look at her. She was in no way like any woman I had seen. All of them had been much like the men, brawny and close-knit, as well fitted for their work as are men for war. But this chit was all but slender, not skinny, but prettily rounded out and soft-like. I cannot say that I admired her at first glance. She seemed fit only to look at, not to live. I was minded of some of the ancient carvings, which showed delicate, lightly built animals that have long since been killed off, graceful trifles that rested the eye. As for the old man, "Aye, thou art brave and wondrously strong, my lad," said he, still a bit shaky from his close call. I was pleased with the acknowledgment, and turned back. It was nothing, I told them, and I recounted some of my exploits, notably one in which I routed a raiding party of men from Clough, 6 in all, carrying in 2 alive on my shoulders. I am the son of Strok, the armorer. "Ye are Strokor," marveled the girl, staring at me as though I were a god. Then she threw back her head and stepped close. I am Ave. This is Maka. He is my uncle, but best known as a stargazer. My father was Durok, the engine maker. She watched my face. Durok? I knew him well. My father had said that he was quite as brainy as himself. He were a fine man, Ave. Aye, said she proudly. She stepped closer. I could not but see how like him she was, though a woman, and next second she laid a hand on my arm. I am yet a free woman, Strokar. Hast thou picked thy mate? And her cheeks flamed. Now, 'twas not my first experience of the kind. Many women had looked like that at me before, but I had always been a man's man, and had ever heeded my father's warning to have naught whatever to do with women. They are the worst trick of all, he told me, and I had never forgot. Belike, I owe much of my power to just this. But Ave had acted too quickly for me to get away. I laughed again and shook her off. I will have naught to do with ye, I told her civilly enough. When I am ready to take a woman, I shall take her, not before. At that the blood left her face. She stood very straight, and her eyes flashed dangerously. Were she a man, I should have stood on my guard. But she made no move. Only the softness in her eyes gave way to such a savage look that I was filled with amaze. And thus I left them, the old man calling down the blessing of John upon me for having saved his life, and the chit glaring after me as though no curses would suffice. A right queer matter, I thought at the time. I guessed not what would come of it. Not then. End of section 6. Recording by Steve Boyce. Website www.stevebuys.net. Boyce is spelled B-U-Y-S. Section 7 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Boyce. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 2, The Story. Chapter 2, The Vision. 'Twas a fortnight later, more or less, when next I saw Maka. I was lumbering along in my chariot, feeling most uncomfortable under the eyes of my friends. For one foot of my machine had a loose link, and 'twas flapping absurdly. And I liked it none too well when Maka stopped his own rattletrap in front of mine, and came running to my window. Next moment I forgot his impertinence. "Strokar," he whispered, his face alive with excitement. "Thou art a brave man, and didst save my life. Now know you that a party of the men of Clow have secreted themselves under the stairway behind the Emperor's throne. They have killed the guards, and will of a certainty kill the Emperor too." "'Twould serve the dolt right," I replied, for I really cared but little. "But why have ye come to me, old man? I am but a lieutenant in the armory. I am not the captain of the palace guard." "Because," he answered, gazing at me pleasingly, "thou couldst dispose of the whole party single-handed. There are but 4, and gain much glory for thyself." "By John!" I swore, vastly delighted, and without stopping to ask Maka whence he had got his knowledge, I went at once to the spot. However, when I got back I sought the stargazer. I ought to mention that I had no trouble with the louts, and that the Emperor himself saw me finishing off the last of them. I sought the stargazer, and demanded how he had known. "Hast ever heard of Edam?" he inquired in return. "Edam? I had not. The name was strange to me. Who is he?
A man as young as thyself, but a mere stripling, quoth Maka. He was a pupil of mine when I taught in the house of learning. Of late he has turned to prophecy, and it is fair remarkable how well the lad doth guess. At all events, 'twas he, Strokor, who told me of the plot. He saw it in a dream.
Then Ida must yet be in Vlama, said I, if he were able to tell ye. Canst bring him to me? I would know him. And so it came about that on the eve of that same day Maka brought Edom to my house. I remember it well, for 'twas the same day that the Emperor, in gratitude of my little service in the anteroom, had relieved me from my post in the armory, and made me captain of the palace guard. I was thus become the youngest captain, also the biggest and strongest, and as will soon appear, by far the longest headed. I was in high good humor, and had decided to celebrate with a feast. So when my two callers arrived, I sat them down before a meal such as cost a tenth.
Footnote. Since Mercury had no moon, its people never coined a word to correspond with our month, and for the same reason they never had a week. Their time was reckoned only in days, years, and fractions of the two. End footnote.
Of my year's salary. I served not only the usual products of the field, variously prepared, but as a special gift from the Emperor's own stock, a piece of mulika meat, frozen, which had been found in the Northland by some geologists a few years back. It had been kept in the palace icing room all this time, and was in prime condition. Maka and I enjoyed it overmuch, but Edom would touch it not. He was a slightly built lad, not at all the sturdy man that I am, but of less than half the weight. His head too was unlike mine. His forehead was wide as well as tall, and his eyes were mild as a slave's. Ye are very young to be a prophet, I said to him after we were filled, and the slaves had cleared away our litter. Tell me, hast foretold anything else that has come to pass?
Aye, he replied, not at all boldly, but what some called modestly. I prophesied the armistice that now stands between our empire and Klaus.
Is this true? I demanded of Maka. The old man bowed his head gravely, and looked upon the young man with far more respect than I felt. He added,
Tell Strokor the dream thou hadst 2 nights ago, Edom. It were a right strange thing, whether true or no.
The stripling shifted his weight on his stool, and moved the bowl closer. Then he thrust his pipe deep into it, and let the liquid flow slowly out his nostrils.
Footnote. A curious custom among the Mercurians, who had no tobacco. There is no other way to explain some of the carvings. Doubtless the liquid was sweet-smelling, and perhaps slightly narcotic. End footnote. I saw this, he began, immediately before rising, and after a very light supper, so I know that it was a vision from John, and not of my own making. I was standing upon the summit of a mountain, and gazing down upon a very large fertile valley. It was heavily wooded, dark green and inviting. But what first drew my attention was a great number of animals moving about in the air. They were passing strange affairs, some large, some small, variously colored, and all covered with the same sort of fur, quite unlike any hair I have ever seen.
In the air? I echoed, recovering from my astonishment. Then I laughed mightily. Man, you must be crazy. There is no animal can live in the air. Ye must mean in the water, or on land.
Nay, interposed the stargazer, Thou hast never studied the stars, Strokar, or thou wouldst know that there be a number of them which, through the enlarging tube, show themselves to be round worlds, like unto our own. And it doth further appear that these other worlds also have air like this we breathe, and that some have less, while others have even more. From what Edom has told me, finished the old man, I judge that this vision took place on Geos. Footnote: the Mercurian word for earth. End footnote. A world much larger than ours according to my calculations, and doubtless having enough air to permit very light creatures to move about in it. Go on, said I to Edom good-humouredly. I be ever willing to believe anything strange when my stomach is full. The dreamer had taken no offence. Then I bent my gaze closer, as I am always able in visions, and I saw that the greenery was most remarkably dense, tangled and luxurious to a degree not ever seen here, and moving about in it was the most extraordinary collection of beings that I have ever laid these eyes upon. There were some huge creatures, quite as tall as thy house, Strokar, with legs as big around as that huge chest of thine. They had tails as had our ancient Mulika, save that these were terrific things, as long and as big as the trunk of large tree. I know not their names. Footnote: probably the dinosaur. End footnote. And then at the other extreme was a tiny creature of the air, which moved with a musical hum. It could have hid under thy fingernails, Strokar, yet it had a tiny sharp-pointed bill, with which it stung most aggravatingly. And between these two there were any number of creatures of varying size and shape. But nowhere was there a sign of a man. True, there was one hairy, grotesque creature which hung by its hands and feet from the tree-tops, very like thee in some way, Strokar, but its face and head were those of a brainless beast, not of a man. Nowhere was a creature like me or thee. And the most curious thing was this. Although there were 10 times as many of these creatures, big and little, to the same space as on our world, yet there was no great amount of strife. In truth, there is far more combat and destruction among we men than among the beasts. And, he spoke most earnestly, as though he would not care to be disbelieved, I saw fathers fight to protect their young. I near fell from my stool in my amaze. Never in all my life had I heard a thing so far from the fact. What? I shouted. Ye sit there like a sane man, and tell me ye saw fathers fight for their young? He nodded his head, still very gravely. I fell silent for want of words, but Maka put in a thought. It would appear, Strokar, that it be not so much of an effort for beings to live there on Geos as here. Perchance 'tis the greater amount of vegetation. At all accounts, the animals need not prey upon one another so generally, and that then would explain why some have energy enough to waste in the care of their young. I can understand, I said very slowly. I can understand why a mother will fight for her babes. 'Tis reasonable enough, no doubt. But as for fathers doing the same, Edom, doth mean to say that all creatures on Geos do this? Nay, only some. It may be that fewer than half of the varieties have the custom. Howbeit, 'tis a beautiful one. When the vision ended, I was right loath to go. Faugh! I spat upon the ground. Such softness makes me ill. I be glad I were born in a man's world, where I can take a man's chances. I want no favoring. If I am strong enough to live, I live. If not,
I die. What more can I ask?" "Aye, my lad," said Maka approvingly. "This be a world for the strong. There is no room here for others. There is scarce enough food for those who, thanks to their own strength, do survive." He slipped the gold band from off his wrist and held it up for John to see. "Here, Strokor, a pledge. A pledge to the survival of the fittest." "A neat, neat wording," I roared, as I took the pledge with him. Then we both stopped short. Edom had not joined us. "Edom, my lad," spake the old man, "ye will take the pledge with us?" The stripling's eyes were troubled. Well he knew that, once he refused such an act, he were no longer welcome in my house, nor in Maka's. But when he looked around, it were bravely enough.
"Men, I have neither the strength of the one, nor the brains of the other of thee. I am but a watchmaker. I live because of my skill with the little wheels. I have no quarrel with either of ye."
He got to his feet and started to the door.
"But I cannot take the pledge with ye. I have seen a wondrous thing, and I love it. And though I know not why, I feel that John has willed it for Geos to see a new race of men, a race even better than ours."
I leapt to my feet. "Better than ours? Mean ye to say, stripling, that there can be a better man than Strokar?" I fully expected him to shrink from me in fear. I was able to crush him with one blow. But he stood his ground. Nay, stepped forward and laid a hand easily upon my shoulder.
"Strokor, ye are more than a man. Ye are two men in one. There is no finer, I say it fair. And yet I doubt not that there can be, and will be a better."
And with that, such a curious expression came into his face, such a glow of some strange land of warmth, that I let my hand drop and suffered him to depart in peace. Such was my wonder. Besides, any miserable lout could have destroyed the lad. Maka sat deep in thought for a time, and when he did speak, he made no mention of the lad who had just quit us. Instead, he looked me over long and earnestly, and at the end he shook his head sorrowfully and sighed. "Thou art the sort of son I would have had, Strokar, given the wits of thy father to hold a woman like thy mother, and thou didst save my life." He mused a little longer, then roused himself and spake sharply. "Thou art a vain man, Strokar." "Aye," I agreed willingly enough, "and none has better cause than I." He would not acknowledge the quip. "Thou hast everything needful to tickle thy vanity. Thou hast the envy of those who note thy strength, the praise of them who love thy courage, and the respect of they who value thy brains. All these thou hast, and yet ye have not that which is best." I thought swiftly, and turned on him with a frown. "Mean ye that I am not handsome enough?" "Nay, Strokar," quoth the stargazer, "there be none handsomer in this world, no matter what the standard of any other, such as Edom's Geos. It is not that. It is that thou hast no ambition." I considered this deeply. At first thought it was not true. Had I not always made it a point to best my opponent? From my youth it had been ever my custom to succeed where bigger bodies and older minds had failed. Was not this ambition? But before I disputed the point with Maka, I saw what he meant. I had no final ambition, no ultimate goal for which to strive. I had been content from year to year to outdo each rival as he came before me, and now, with mind and body alike in the pink of condition, I was come to the place where none durst stand before me. Ye are right, Maka, I admitted, not because I cared to gratify his conceit, but because it were always for my own good to own up when wrong, that I might learn the better. Ye are right. I need to decide upon a life purpose. What have ye thought? The old man was greatly pleased. Our talk with Edam brought it all before me. Know you, Strokor, that the survival of the fittest is a rule which governs man as well as men? It applies to the entire population, Strokor, just as truly as to me or thee. In fine, we men who are now the sole inhabitants of this world are descended from a race of people who survived solely because they were fitter than the Mulika, fitter than the reptiles, the fittest by far of all the creatures. That being the case, it is plain that in time either our empire or that of Klaus must triumph over the other, and that which remains shall be the fittest. Hold, I cried. Why cannot matters remain just as they are now, and forever? That, he said rapidly, is because thou knowest so little about the future of this world. But I am famed as a student of the heavens, and I tell thee it is possible by means of certain delicate measuring instruments, together with the highest mathematics, to keep a very close watch upon the course of our world. And we now know that our year is much shorter than it was in the days of the Mulika. I nodded my head. Rightly enough, since our days are become steadily longer for some mysterious reason. A reason no longer a mystery, quoth Maka. It is now known that the sun is a very powerful magnet, and that it is constantly pulling upon our world and bringing it nearer and nearer to himself. That is why it hath become slightly warmer during the past 100 years. The records show it plain. And the same influence has caused the lengthening of our day. He stopped and let me think. Soon I saw it clearly enough. A time must come when the increasing warmth of the sun would stifle all forms of vegetable life, and that would mean the choking of mankind. It might take untold centuries. Yet, plainly enough, the world must some day become too small for even those who now remained upon it. Suddenly I leapt to my feet and strode the room in my excitement. Ye are right, Maka, I shouted, thoroughly aroused. There cannot always be the two empires. In time one or the other must prevail. John has willed it. And I stopped short and stared at him. I need not tell ye which it shall be. I knew thou wouldst see the light, Strokor. Thou hast thy father's brains. I sat me down, but instantly leapt up again, such was my enthusiasm. Maka, I cried, our emperor is not the man for the place. It is true that he were a brave warrior in his youth. He won the throne fairly, and we have suffered him to keep it because he is a wise man, and because we have had little trouble with the men of Clow since their defeat 2 generations agone. But he today is content to sit at his ease and quoth platitudes about live and let live. Faugh! I am ashamed that I should ever have given ear to him. I stopped short and glared at the old man. Maka, hark ye well.
If it be the will of John to decide between the men of Clow and the men of Lamaland, then it is my intent to take a hand in this decision." "Aye, my lad," he said tranquilly, and then added, quite as though he knew what my answer must be, "How do ye intend to go about it?" "Like a man. I, Strokor, shall become the emperor."
End of section 7. Recording by Steve Boyce. Website www.stevebuys.net. Boyce is spelled Buys. Section 8 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Boyce. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 2, The Story. Chapter 3, The Throne.
A small storm had come up while Maka and I were talking. Now, as he was about to quit me, the clouds were clearing away, and an occasional stroke of lightning came down. One of these, however, hit the ground such a short distance away that both of us could smell the smoke. My mind was more alive than it had ever been before. "Now what caused that, Maka? The lightning, I mean. We have it nearly every day, yet I have never thought to question it before." "It is no mystery, my lad," quoth Maka, dodging into his chariot so that he was not wet. "I myself have watched the thing from the top of the high mountains, where the air is so light that a man can scarce get enough to fill his lungs. And I say unto you that, were it not for all the air we have, we would have naught save the lightning. The space about the air is full of it." He started his engine, then leaned out into the rain and said softly, "Hold fast to what thy father has taught thee, Strokar. Have nothing to do with women. 'Tis a man's job ahead of thee, and the future of the empire is in thy hands." And, as he clattered off, "Fill not thy head with wonderings about the lightning." "Aye," said I earnestly, and immediately turned my thoughts to my new ambition. And yet, the thing that Maka had just told me kept coming back to my mind, and so it does to this very day. I know not why I should mention it at all, save that each time I think upon Maka, I also think upon the lightning, whether I will or no. I slept not at all that night, but sat.
Footnote. It seems to have been the custom among the soldiers never to lie down, but to take their sleep sitting or standing, a habit not hard to form when the gravitation was so slight. No doubt this also explains their stunted legs. End footnote.
Till the dawn came, thinking out a plan of action. By that time I was fair convinced that there was naught to be gained by waiting. Waiting makes me impatient as well. I determined to act at once, and since one day is quite as good as the next, I decided that this day was to see the thing begun. I came before the Emperor at noon and received my decorations. Within the hour I had made myself known to the 94 men who were to be my command. A picked company, all of a height and weight, with bodies that lacked little of my own perfection. Never was there a finer guard about the palace. My first care was to pick a quarrel with the outgoing commander. 'Twere easy enough. He was green with envy anyhow. And so it came about that we met about mid-afternoon, with seconds, in a well-frequented field in the outskirts. Before supper was eaten, my entire troop knew that their new captain had tossed his ball-slinger away without using it,
had taken 20 balls from their former commander's weapon, and while thus wounded had charged a man and dispatched him with bare hands. Needless to say, this exploit quite won their hearts. None but a blind man could have missed the respect they showed me when, all bandaged and sore, I lined them up next morning. Afterwards I learned that they had all taken a pledge to follow Strokor through the gates of Hof itself. 'Twere but a week later, fully recovered and in perfect fettle, I called my men together one morn as the sun rose. By that time I had given them a sample of my brains, through ordering a rearrangement of their quarters, such as made the same much more comfortable. Also, I had dealt with one slight infraction of the rules in such a drastic fashion that they knew I would brook no trifling. All told, 'tis hard to say whether they thought the most of me or of John. "Men," said I as bluntly as I knew, "the Emperor is an old man, and as ye know he is disposed to be lenient toward the men of Clow, whereas ye and I well know that the louts are blackguards. Now I will tell ye more. It has come to me lately that Clow is plotting to attack us with strange weapons. I thought best, considering their ignorance, not to give them my own reasons. Of course I have told the Emperor of it, yet he will not act. He says to wait till we are attacked." I stopped and watched their faces. Sure enough, the idea fair made them ache. Each and every one of these men was spoiling for a fight. "Now tell me, how would ye like to become the Emperor's bodyguard?" I did not have to wait long. The light that flared in their faces told me plainly. "And how would ye like to have me for your Emperor?" At that their tongues were loosed, and I hindered them not. They yelled for pure joy, and pressed about me like a pack of children. I saw that the time was ripe for action. "Up then!" I roared, and of course led the way. We met the Emperor's guard on the lower stairs, and from that point on we fair hacked our way through. Well, no need to describe the fight. For a time I thought we were gone. The guards had a cunningly devised labyrinth on the second floor, and attacked us from holes in a false ceiling, so that we suffered heavily at first. But I saw what was amiss, and shouted to my men to clear away the timbers, and after that it was clear work. I lost 40 men before the guard was disposed of. The Emperor I finished myself. He dodged right spryly for a time, but at last I caught him and tossed him to the foot of the upper stairs. And there he still lies, for none of my men would touch him, nor would I. We covered him with quicklime and some earth. As soon as we had taken care of those who were not too far gone, I called the men together and caused a round of spirits to be served. Then we all feasted on the Emperor's store, and soon were feeling like ourselves. "Men," I said impressively, "I am proud of ye. Never did an emperor have such a dangerous gang of bullies." At that they all grinned happily, and I added, "And 'tis a fine staff of generals that ye'll make." Need I say more? Those men would have overturned the palace for me had I said the word. As it was, they obeyed my next orders in such a spirit that success was assured from the first. First, using the dead emperor's name, I caused the various chiefs to be brought together at once to the court chamber. At the same time I contrived, by means I need not go into here, to prevent any word of our action from getting abroad. So when the former staff faced me the next morning, they learned that they were to be executed. I could trust not one.
They were all friends of the old man. With the chiefs out of the way, and my own men taking their commands, the whole army fell into my hands. True, there were some insurrections here and there, but my men handled them with such speed and harshness that any further stubbornness turned to admiration. By this time the fame of Strokor was spread throughout the empire. And thus it came about that, within a week of the night that old Maka first put the idea into my head, Strokor, son of Strok, reigned throughout Vlamaland. And to make it complete, the army celebrated my ascension by taking a pledge before John, to Strokor, the fittest of the fit.
End of section 8. Recording by Steve Boyce. Website www.stevebuys.net. Boyce is spelled B-U-Y-S. Section 9 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Boyce. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 2, The Story. Chapter 4, The Assault.
Now, out of a total population of perhaps 3 million, I had about 250,000 first-class fighters in my half of the world. Clow, by comparison, had but 2/3 the number. His land was not a rich one. But he had the advantage of knowing, some while in advance, of the new ruler in Vlama, and shortly my spies reported that his armories were devising a new type of weapon. 'Twas a strange verification of my own fiction to my men. I could learn nothing, however, about it. Meanwhile, I caused a vast number of flatboats to be built, all in secret. Each of them was intended for a single fighter and his supplies, and each was so arranged with side paddle wheels that it would be driven by the motor in the soldier's chariot, and thus give each his own boat. Again, discarding all precedent, I packed not all my forces together as had been done in the past, but scattered them up and down the coast fronting the land of Clow. And at a prearranged time my 250,000 men set out, a company in each tiny fleet. Some were slightly in advance of the rest, who had the shorter distance to travel. And just as I had planned, we all arrived at a certain spot on Clow's coast at practically the same hour, although 2 nights later. 'Twas a brilliant stroke. The enemy looked not for a fleet of water ants, ready to step right out of the sea into battle. Their fleet was looking for us, true, but not in that shape. And we were all safely ashore before they had ceased to scour the seas for us. I immediately placed my heavy machines, and just as all former expeditions had done, opened the assault at once with a shower of the poison shells. I relied, it will be seen, upon the surprise of my attack to strike terror into the hearts of the louts. But apparently they were prepared for anything, no matter how rapid the attack. My bombardment had not proceeded many moments before, to my dismay, some of their own shells began to fall among us. Soon they were giving as good as we. Now how knew they that we should come to this spot? I demanded of Maka. I had placed him in my cabinet as soon as I had reached the throne. The old man stroked his beard gravely. Perchance it had been wrong to come to the old landing. They simply began shelling it as a matter of course. Ye are right again, I told him. and forthwith moved my pieces over into another triangle. Previously, of course, all my charioteers had gone on toward the capital. However, I took care to move my machines one at a time, so that there was no let-up in my bombardment. But scarce had we taken up the new position, before the enemy's shells likewise shifted, and began to strike once more in our midst. I swore a great oath, and whirled upon Maka in wrath. "Think ye that there be a spy among us?" I demanded. "How else can ye explain this thing? My men have combed the land about us. There are none of the lout secreted here, and even so they could not have notified Clow so soon. Besides, 'tis pitch dark." I were sorely mystified. All we could do was to fling our shells as fast as our machines would work, and dodge the enemy's hail as best we could. Thus the time passed, and it were near dawn when the first messengers
Footnote: Messengers, no telegraph or telephone, much less wireless. In a civilization as strenuous as that of Mercury, there was never enough consideration for others to lead to such socially beneficial things as these. No more than railroads or printing presses. Civilization appears to be in exact proportion to the ease of getting a living, other conditions being equal. End footnote.
returned. "They have stopped us just outside the walls of the city," was the report. It pleased me that they should have pushed so far at first. I climbed at once into my chariot. "Now is the time for Strokor to strike." I gave orders for the staff to remain where it was. "I will send ye word when the city is mine." But before I started my engine, I glanced up at the sky to see if the dawn were yet come. And as I gazed, I thought I saw something come between me and a star. I brushed the hair away from my eyes and looked again. To my boundless surprise, I made out not one, but 3 objects moving about swiftly in the air. "Look!" I cried, and my whole staff craned their necks. In a moment all had seen, and great was their wonder. I blamed them not for their fears. 'Twas Maka who spoke first. "They are much too large to be creatures of Jordan," he muttered. "They must be some trick of the enemy. Dost recall Edam's vision of the creatures in the air of Geos?" he went on, knowing that I would not hinder him. "Now, as I remember it, he said they flew with great speed. Were it not possible, Strokor, for suitable engines to propel very light structures at such high speed as to remain suspended in the air, after the manner of leaves in a storm? I note these strangers move quite fast." It was even so, and at that same instant one of them swung directly above our heads, so close that I could hear the hum of a powerful engine. So it was only a trick. I shook myself together. "Attention!" My staff drew up at the word. "They are but few. Fear them not. We waste no time here. Pack up the machines and follow." And thus we charged upon Clow. I found that my men had entirely surrounded the city. Clow's men were putting up a plucky fight, and showing no signs of fearing us. Seeing this, I blew a blast on my engine's whistle, so that my bullies might know that I had come. Immediately the word ran up and down the line, so that within a few minutes Clow was facing a roaring crowd of half-mad terrors. I myself set the example by charging the nearest group of the enemy, all of whom were mounted within the rather small and perfectly circular chariots which they preferred. They were quick but slippery. Also, they could not stand before a determined rush, as several of them learned after vainly trying to slip some balls through my windows, and failing in that, striving to get away from me. But I ran them down, and toppled them over, and dropped suffocation bombs into their little cages with such vigor and disregard of their volleys that my men could not resist the example. We charged all along that vast circular line, and we cheered mightily when the whole front broke, turned tail, and ran before us. But scarce had they got away before a queer thing happened. A flock of those great air creatures, some 8 altogether, rose up from the middle of the city. It was now fairly light, and we could see well. One of them had some sort of engine trouble, so that it had to return at once. But the other 7 came out to the battle line and began to circle the city. As they did so, they dropped odd, misshapen parcels, totally unlike materials of war. But when they struck, they gave off prodigious puffs of a greenish smoke, of so terribly pungent a nature that my men dropped before it like apples from a shaken tree. 'Twas a fearful sight. Lucky for us that the louts had had no practice, else few of us should be alive to tell the tale. And so they swept around the great circle, many triangles in area, and everywhere the unthinkable thing smote the hearts of my men with a fear they had never known. Only one of the devices suffered. It was brought down by a chance fling of a poisoned shell. The rest, after loosing their burdens, returned to the city for more. I am no fool. I saw that we could do nothing against such weapons, but must use all our wits if we escaped even. "Return!" I commanded, and instantly my staff whistled the code. The men obeyed with alacrity, making off at top speed with the men of Clow in hot pursuit, although able to do little damage. Aye, it were a sorrowful thing, that retreat. The best I could do was to remain until the very last, having to deal with a number of persistent louts who all but suffocated me at that. But I managed to empty my slinger into some of them, and to topple the rest. I was mainly angry that Clow had not showed himself. By the time I had reached the seashore, most of my men were in their boats. Again I stayed till the last, although I could see the enemy's fleet bearing down hard upon us from the north. In truth, we would have all been lost had we come in the manner of former campaigns, all together in big transports. But because we could scatter every which way, the fleet harmed us little, and 4/5 of us got safely back. Happily, none of the air machines had range enough to reach Vlamaland. As soon as I could get my staff together, I gave orders such as would ensure discipline. Then, reminding my hearties that Clow, knowing our helplessness, would surely attack as soon as fully equipped, I made this offer. To the man who shall suggest the best way of meeting their attack, I shall give the 1/3 of my empire. So they knew that the case was desperate. As for myself, I slept not a bit, but paced my sleep chamber and thought deeply. Now a bit of a shell from an enemy slinger had penetrated my arm. Till now I had paid no attention to it, but it began to bother me, so I pulled the metal from my arm with my teeth, and quite by chance I placed the billet on the table within a few inches of the compass I had carried on my boat. To my intense surprise, the needle of the compass swung violently about, so that one end pointed directly at the fragment of metal. I moved them closer together. There was no doubt that they were strongly attracted. The enemy's shells were made of mere iron. The moment I fully realized this, I saw clearly how we might baffle the men of Clow. I instantly summoned some men, gave the orders much as though I had thought for years what was to be done, and in a few moments had the satisfaction of seeing my messengers hurrying north and south. And so it came about that, within 3 days of our shameful retreat, 1/10 of my men were at work on the new project. As yet, there was no word from my spies across the sea, but we worked with all possible haste, and this, very briefly, is what we did. We laid a gigantic line of iron clear across the empire, from north to south, from snow to snow. One end was bedded in the island of Pathna, where the North Magnetic Pole is found, while the other stopped at the opposite side of the world, in a hole dug through the ice into the solid earth of the South Polar Plain. And every foot of that enormous rod, 'twas as big around as my leg, was insulated from the ground with pieces of our secret non-magnetic alloy. Not for nothing had our chemists sought the metal which would resist the lightning, and not for nothing did my bullies piece the rod together, all working at the same time, so that the whole thing were complete in 7 days. That is, complete save for the final connecting link, and that lay, a log-like roll of iron, at the door of my palace, ready to be rolled into place when I were but ready. And on the morrow the Clow reached our shores.
End of section 9. Recording by Steve Boyce. Website www.stevebuys.net. Boyce is spelled B-U-Y-S. Section 10 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Boyce. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 2, The Story. Chapter 5, The Victory.
My first intent was to let them advance unhampered, but Maka pointed out that such a policy might give them suspicions, and so we disputed their course all the way. I gave orders to show no great amount of resistance, and thus the louts reached Vlama in high feather, confident that the game was theirs. I stood at the door of the palace as Clow himself rolled up to the edge of the parade ground. My men, obeying orders, had given way to him. His crews swarmed the space behind and on all sides of him, while my own bullies were all about and behind the palace. Never did two such giant armies face one another in peace, for I had caused my banner to be floated wrong end to, in token of surrender. First, a small body of subordinates waited upon me, demanding that I give up the throne. I answered that I would treat with none save Clow himself, and shortly the knave, surrounded by perhaps 50 underlings, stepped up before me. "Hail, Strokor!" he growled, his voice shaking a bit with excitement, not with fear, for he were a brave man. "Hail to thee and to thine, and a pleasant stay in Hof for ye all." "Hail, Clow," replied I, glancing up meaningfully at the air monsters wheeling there. "I take it that ye purpose to execute us." "Aye," he growled savagely. "Thou didst attack without provocation. Thy life is forfeit, and as many more as may be found needful to guarantee peace." "Then," I quoth, my manner changing, "then ye have saved me the trouble of deciding what shall be thy fate. Execution, say you? So be it." And I strode down to the great log of iron which lay ready to fill the gap. Clow looked at me with a peculiar expression, as though he thought me mad. True, it looked it. How could I do him harm without myself suffering? But I kicked the props which held the iron, and gave it a start with my foot. The ends of the pole-to-pole rod lay concealed by brush, perchance 50 yards away. In 10 seconds that last section had rolled completely between them, and only a fool would have missed seeing that, the last 10 feet, the iron was fair jerked through the air. As this happened, we all heard a tremendous crackling, like that of nearby lightning, while enormous clouds of dust arose from the 2 concealed ends, which were now become connections, and at the same time a loud, steely click, just one and no more, sounded from the intruding host. For a moment Clow was vastly puzzled. Then he snarled angrily. "What means this foolery, Strucker? Advance and give up thy axe!" For answer I turned me about, so as to face my man, and held up my hand in signal. Instantly the whistles sounded, and my hearties came bounding into the field. "Treachery!" shouted Clow, and his officers ran here and there, shouting, "To arms! Charge and destroy! No quarter!" But I paid little attention to the hubbub. I were gazing up at those infernal creatures of the air, and my heart sang within me as I saw them circling erratically but very surely down to the earth. And as they came nearer, my satisfaction was entire, for their engines were silent. At the same time, consternation was reigning among our visitors. Not a man of all Clow's thousands was able to move his car or lift a weapon. Every slinger was jammed as though frozen by invisible ice. All their balls and shells were stuck together like the work of a transparent glue. Even their sidearms were locked in their scabbards, and all their tugging could budge them not. But none of my men were so handicapped. Each man's chariot was running as though naught had happened. They thundered forward, discharging their balls and shells as freely as they had across the sea. Their charge was a murderous one. Not a man of Clow's was able to resist, save with what force he could put into his bare hands. Clow saw all this from the middle of his group of officers. None were able to more than place his body twixt us and their chief. In a very few moments they saw that the unknown magic had made them as children in our hands. They were utterly lost, and Clow turned away from the sight with a black face. Again he faced me. "What means this, ye huge bundle of lies? What mean ye by tricking us with yon badge of surrender, only to tie our hands with thy magic of oath? Is this the way to fight like a man?" I had stood at ease in my door since rolling the iron. Now I looked about me still more easily. My men were running down the louts, who had jumped from their useless chariots and taken to their heels. 'Twere but a matter of time before the army of Clow would be no more at that rate. "Clow," I answered him mildly, "ye are right. This is not the way to fight like a man. Neither," I pointed out one of the fallen air cars, "neither is that the way, flitting over our heads like shadows, and destroying us with filthy smoke. Shame on ye, Clow, for stooping to such, and upon thy head be the blame for the trick I have played upon ye." "You attacked us without provocation," he muttered sourly. "Aye, and for a very good reason," I replied. "Yet I see thy viewpoint, and shall give thee the benefit of the doubt." I turned to my whistlers and gave an order, so that presently the great slaughter had stopped. My men and Clow's alike struggled back to see what were amiss. I handed Clow an axe. "Throw away thine own, scabbard and all," I told him. "It is useless, for 'tis made of iron. Ours and all our tools of war are formed of an alloy which is immune from the magic." He took the axe in wonderment. "What means it, Strokar?" asked he again, meanwhile stripping himself in a businesslike fashion that it were good to see. "It means," said I, throwing off my robe, "that I have unchained the magnetism of this world. Know you, Clow, that all of the children of the sun are full of his power. It is like unto that of the tiny magnet which ye give children for to play, but it is mighty, even as our world is mighty." "Good John," he gasped, for his was not a daring mind. "What have ye done, ye trifler?" "I have transformed this empire into one vast magnet," I answered coolly. Then I showed him a boulder on the summit of a distant hill. Through the tube, Clow could see some of my men standing beside it. "Place one of thy own men on the roof of the palace," I told Clow, "and give him orders to lower my banner should ye give him the word. For upon the outcome of this fight twixt me and thee, Clow, hinges the whole affair. If thou dost survive, down comes my banner, and my men on the hill shall topple the boulder, which shall rush down the slope and burst the iron rod and break the spell. Stand then and defend thyself." And it did me good to see the spirit fly into his eyes. He saw that his empire lived or died as he lived or died, and he fought as he had never fought before. Small man that he was beside myself, he were wondrous quick and sure in his motions. Before I knew it, he had bit his axe deep into my side. And in another moment or two, it was over. For as soon as I felt the pain of that gash, I flung my own blade away, and with a roar such as would have shaken a stouter heart than his, I charged a man, took a second fearful blow full on my chest, and heeding it not at all, I snatched the axe from his hands. Then, as he turned to run, I dropped that tool also, and I ran him down, and felled him, and broke his head with my hands.
End of section 10. Recording by Steve Boyce. Website www.steveboyce.net. Boyce is spelled B-U-Y-S. Section 11 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Boyce. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 2, The Story. Chapter 6, The Fittest. Footnote. This chapter was originally as long as the others, but an unfortunate accident of Mr. Smith's, before he was thoroughly familiar with the machine, mutilated a large portion of the tape so badly that it was made worthless. This explains why something appears to be missing from the account, and also why this chapter begins in the middle of a sentence. End footnote.
Slaves, but the most were slain. Neither could we bother with their women and others left behind. Now by this time the empire was as one man in its worship of me. I had been emperor but a year, and already I had made it certain that only the men of Vlamaland and no others should live in the sight of John. So well thought they of me, I might fair have sat upon my reputation, and have spent my last days in feasting like the man before me. But I was still too young and full of energy to take my ease. I found myself more and more restless. I had naught to do. It had all been done. At last I sent for old Maka. "Ye put me up to this, ye old fraud!" I told him, pretending to be wrathful. "Now set me another task, or I'll have thy head." He knew me too well to be affrighted. He said that he had been considering my case of late. "Strokor, thy father was right when he told thee to have naught to do with women. That is to say, he were right at the time. Were he alive today, I forgot to say that my father was killed in the battle across the sea, he would of a certainty say that it were high time for thee to pick thy mate. Remember, Strokor, great though thou art, yet when death taketh thee, thy greatness is become a memory. Methinks ye should leave something more substantial behind." It took but little thought to convince me that Maka were right once more. Fact, as soon as I thought upon it, it were a woman that I was restless for. The mere notion instantly gave me something worthwhile to look forward to. "John bless thee," I told the old man. "Ye have named both the trouble and the remedy. I will attend to it at once." He sat thinking for some time longer. "Hast thought of any woman in special, Strokor?" said he. I had not. The idea was too new to me. "The best in the world shall be mine, of course," I told him. "But as for which one, hast any notion thyself?" "Aye," he quoth, "'tis my own niece I have in mind. Perchance ye remember her, a pretty child, who was with me when thou didst save my life up there on the mountainside." I recalled the chit fairly well. "But she were not a vigorous woman, Maka? Think you she is fit for me?" "Aye, if any be," he replied earnestly. "Ave is not robust, true, but her muscles are as wires. It is because of what lies in her head, however, that I commend her. I have taught her all I know." "So," I exclaimed, much pleased. "Then she is indeed fit to be the Empress, and as I recall her, she were exceedingly good to look at." "Say no more. Ave shall be the wife of Strokor." And so it was arranged. Well, and there ye have the story of Strokor, the mightiest man in the world, and the wisest. More than this I shall not tell with my own lips. I shall have singers recite my deeds until half the compartments in the house of words is filled with the records thereof. But it were well that I should tell this much in mine own way. My ambition is fulfilled. Let the hand of John descend upon our world, if it may. I care not if presently the sun come nearer, and the water dry up, and the days grow longer and longer, till the day and the year become of the same length. I care not. My people, such as be left of them, shall own what there is, and shall live as long as life is possible. I shall leave behind no race of weaklings. Each man shall be fit to live, and the fittest of them all shall live the longer. And he, no matter how many cycles hence, shall look back to Strokor, and to Ave his wife, and shall say, I am what I am, the last man on the world, because Strokor was the fittest man of his time. Aye, my fame shall live as long as there be life. Tonight, as I speak these things into the word machine, my heart is singing with the joy of it all. Thank John I were born a man, not a woman. Tomorrow I go to fetch Ave. I shall not send for her. I cannot trust her beauty to the hands of my crew. The more I think of her, the more I see that mine whole life hath been devised for this one moment. I see that, insignificant though she be, Ave is a needed link in the chain. I have come to want her more than food. I am become a lovesick fool. I can afford to poke fun at myself. I can afford anything in this world, for I be its greatest man. Its greatest man. Here is the place to stop. There is no more I can say. The story is done. The story of Strokor, the greatest man in the world.
End of section 11. Recording by Steve Boyce. Website www.stevebuys.net. Boyce is spelled B-U-Y-S. Section 12 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Boyce. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 2, The Story. Chapter 7, The Going.
'Tis several years since last I faced this machine. Many and many a day since I said that my story was done, and placed the record on the shelf of my anteroom, my heart full of satisfaction. And today I must needs add another record, perhaps 2 to the pile. When I set out for the Highlands, on the morn following what I last related, I took with me but 2 or 3 men. Not that I had any need for guards, but because it looketh not well for the emperor to travel without retainers, however few. Practically, I was alone. I reached the locality as the sun went down. The sky was a brilliant color. I remember it well. Darkness would come soon, though not as quickly as farther south. Commonly I think not upon such trifles, but I were nearing my love, and tender things came easily to my mind. My chariot kept to the road which lay alongside the irrigating flume, a stone trough which runs from the stone-covered hills to the dry country below. I had already noted this flume when it emptied into the basin in the valley below, for it had a new kind of a spillway affixed to it, a broad, smooth platform with a slightly upward curve, over which the water was shooting. I saw no sense in the arrangement, and made up my mind to ask Maka about it, for the Empire prized this trough most highly. It ran straight and true, over expensive bridges where needed, with scarce a bend to hold back the flow. When I stopped my car outside the house, I was surprised that none should come out to greet me. Maka had sent word of my coming. All should have been in readiness. But I was forced to use my whistle. There was no stir. I became angry. I told my bullies to stay where they were, and myself burst in the door. The house was a sturdy stone affair of 1 floor, set against the side of the mountain, a short distance above the flume. I looked about the interior in surprise, for not a soul was in sight in any of the compartments. There were signs that people had been there but a few moments before. I called it strange, for I had seen no one leave the house as I approached. At last, as I was inspecting the eating place, I noted a small door let into the outer wall. It was open, and by squeezing I managed to get through. I found that it led into a long, dark passage. I followed this, going steadily down a flight of stairs, and all of a sudden bumped into an iron grating. At the same moment I saw that the passageway made a turn just beyond, and by craning my neck and straining my eyes, I could see a faintly lighted chamber just a few feet away. And before my eyes could scarce make out the figures of some people in the middle of the place, a voice came to my ear. "Hail, Strokor!
it said, and great was my astonishment when I recognized the tomes of Edam, the young dreamer whom Maka had brought to my house. "Edam," I cried, "what do ye here? Come and open these bars." He gave no reply, save to laugh in a way I did not like. I shook the grating savagely, so that I felt it give. "Edam," I roared, "open this grating at once, and tell me, where is Ave?" "I am here," came another voice, and I stopped in sheer surprise to peer closer and to see for the first time that it were really the dreamer and the chit, these two and no more, who sat there in the underground chamber. They seemed to be sitting in some sort of a box with glass windows. "Ave, come here." I spoke more gently than to Edam, for my heart was soft with thoughts of her. "It is thy lord Strokar, the emperor, who calls thee. Come." "I stay here," said she in the same clear voice, entirely unshaken by my presence. "Edam hath claimed me, and I shall cleave to him. I want none of ye giant." For a moment I was minded to throw my weight against the barrier, such was my rage. Then I thought better of it, and closely examined the bars. Two were loose. "Ave," said I, contriving to keep my voice even, although my hands were busy with the bars as I spake. "Ave, you do wrong to spite me thus. Know ye not that I am the emperor, and that these bars cannot stand before me? I warn ye, if I must call my men to help me, and to witness my shame, it will go hard with ye. Better that ye should come willingly. Ye are not for such as Edam." "No," quoth the young man, speaking up for the chit. "Ye are wrong, Strokar. We defy thee to do thy worst. We are prepared to flee from ye at all costs." I had twisted one of the bars out of my way without their seeing it. I strove at the next as I answered, still controlling my voice. "'Twill do ye no good to flee, Edam. Ye know that. And as for Ave, she shall wish she had never been born." "So I should," she replied with spirit, "if I were to become thy woman. But know you, Strokar, that Ave, the daughter of Duroc, would rather die than take the name of one who had spurned her as ye did me." So I had. It had slipped my mind. "But I want thee now, Ave," said I softly, preparing to slip through the opening I had made. "Surely ye would not take thine own life?" "Nay," she answered with a laugh in her voice. "Rather I would go with Edam here. I would go," and she finished, her voice rising in her excitement, "away from this horrible man's world, away from it all, Strokar, and to Gios. Hear me? To Gios, and—" But at that instant I burst through the grating. Without a sound I charged straight for the pair of them, and without a sound they slipped away from before my grasp. Next second I was gazing stupidly at the rushing, swirling water of the flume, and I saw that they had been sitting in the cabin of a tiny boat, and that they had got away. There was an opening into the outer air. I rushed through, and stared in the growing twilight down the black furrow of the flume. Far in the distance, and going like a streak, I spied the glittering glass windows of the little craft. Once I made out the flutter of a saucy hand. "We shall get them when they reach the valley," I shouted to my men. Then I reached for my tube, and sighted it on the lower end of the flume, far, far below, almost too far away to be clear to the naked eye. In an incredibly short time, the craft reached the end. It traveled at an extraordinary rate, perchance was weighted. I marveled that its windows could stand the force of the air, and I scarce had time to fear that the twain should be destroyed on that upturned spillway before it was there. And then an awesome thing happened. As the boat struck the incline, it shot upward into the air at a steep slant. Up, up it went. My heart jumped into my mouth, for surely they must be crushed when they came down. But the craft did not come down. It went on and on, up and up. Its speed scarcely slackened. 'Twas like that of a shooting star. And in far less time than it takes to tell it, the little boat was high up among the stars, going higher every instant and farther away from me. And suddenly the sweat broke cold upon my forehead, for dead ahead, directly in line of their travel, lay the bluish-white gleam of Geos. So great was my rage over the escape of the dreamer with my woman. At first I felt no sorrow. Later, after days and days of search in and about the basin, I came to grieve most terribly over my loss. When I came home to the palace, I was well nigh ill. In vain did I make the most generous of rewards. The whole empire turned out to search for the missing ones, but nothing came of it all. Yet I never ceased to hope, especially after my talk with Maka. "Aye," he said when I questioned him, "it were barely possible that they have left this world for all time. I have calculated the speed which their craft might have attained, had it the right proportions, and in truth it might have left the spillway at such a speed that it entirely overcame the draw of the ground. But I think it were a slim chance. It is more likely, Strokar, that Ave shall return to thee."
Was I not the fitter man? Surely Edam's purpose could not succeed. John would not have it so. The woman was mine because I had chosen her, and she must come back to me, and in safety, or I should tear Edam into bits.
But as time went on and naught transpired, I became more and more melancholy. Life became an empty thing. It had been empty enough before I had craved the girl, but now it was empty with hopelessness. After a while, I got to thinking of some of the things Maka had told me. The more I thought of the future, the blacker it seemed. True, there were many other women, but there had been only one Ave. No such beauty had ever graced this world before, and I knew I could be happy with no other. Now I saw that all my fame had been in vain. I had lost the only woman that was fit for me, and when I died there would be naught left but my name. Even that the next emperor might blot out if he chose. It had all been in vain. "It shall not be!" I roared to myself as I strode about my compartment, gnawing at my hands in my misery. And in just such a fit of helpless anger, the great idea came to me, no sooner conceived than put into practice. I will not go closely into details. I will relate just the outstanding facts. What I did was to select a very tall mountain, located almost on the equator, and proclaimed my intention to erect a monument to John upon its summit. I caused vast quantities of materials to be brought to the place, and for a year 100,000 men labored to put the pieces together. When they had finished, they had made a mammoth tower partially of wood and partially of alloy. It was made in sections so that it might be placed, piece upon piece,
one above another high into the sky. It was an enormous task. When it was complete, I had a tower as high as the mountain itself erected upon its summit. And next I caused section after section of the long iron pole-to-pole rod which had tricked Clow to be hauled up into the tower. I was only careful to begin the process from the top and work downward. I gave word that the last 3 sections be inserted at midday at a given day, and at that hour I was safe inside a non-magnetic room. I know right well when the deed was done. There was a most terrific earthquake. All about me, though I could see nothing at all, I could hear buildings falling. The din was appalling. At the same time, the air was fair shattered with the rattle of the lightning. Never have I heard the like before. The rod had loosed the wrath of the forces above our air, and as suddenly the whole deafening storm ended. Perchance the rod was destroyed by the lightning. I never went to see. For I know the electricity split the very ground apart. But I gazed out of a window in the top of my palace, and saw that I had succeeded. Not a soul but myself remained alive. None but buildings made of the alloy were standing. Not only man, but most of his works had perished in that awful blast. I alone remained. I, Strokor, am the survivor. I, the greatest man. It were but fit that I should be the last. No man shall come after me, to honor me or not as he chooses. I and no other shall be the last man. And when Ave returns, as she must, though it be ages hence, when she comes, she shall find me waiting. I, Strokor, the mighty and wise, shall be here when she returns. I shall wait for her forever. Here I shall be. Here I shall always stay. The stars may move from their places, but I shall not go. For it is my intention to make use of another secret Maka taught me. In brief.
Footnote. The record ends here. It may be that Strokor left the machine for some trivial reason and forgot to finish his story. At all events, it is necessary to refer to the further discoveries of the expedition in order to learn the outcome of it all. End footnote. End of section 12. Recording by Steve Buys. Website www.stevebuys.net. Buys is spelled B-U-Y-S.
Section 13 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 3. The Survivor. Provided with a sledgehammer, a crowbar, and a hydraulic jack, and even with drills and explosives as a last resort, Jackson, Kinney, and Van Emmen returned the same day to the walled-in room in the top of that mystifying mansion. The materials they carried would have made considerable of a load had not Smith removed enough of the weights from their suits to offset their burden. They reached the unopened door without special exertion, and with no mishap. They looked in vain for a crack big enough to hold the point of the crowbar. Neither could the most vigorous jabbing loosen any of the material. They dropped that tool and tried the sledge. It got no results. Even in the hands of the husky geologist, the most vigorous blows failed to budge the door. They did not even dent it. So they propped the powerful hydraulic jack, a tool sturdy enough to lift a house, at an angle against the door. Then, using the crowbar as a lever, the architect steadily turned up the screw, the mechanism multiplying his very ordinary strength 100-fold. In a moment it could be seen that he was getting results. The door began to stir. Van Emmon struck one edge with the sledge-hammer and it gave slightly. In another minute the whole door, weighing over a ton, had been pushed almost out of its opening. The jack, overbalanced, toppled over. They did not readjust it, but threw their combined weight upon the barrier. There was no need to try again. With a shiver the huge slab of metal slid upright into the space beyond, stood straight on end for a second or so, then toppled to the floor. And this time they heard the crash. For as the door fell, a great gust of wind rushed out with a hissing shriek, almost overbalancing the men from the earth. They stood still for a while, breathing hard from their exertion, trying in vain to peer into the blackness before them. Under no circumstances would either of them have admitted that he was gathering courage. In a minute the architect, his eyes sparkling with his enthusiasm for the antique, picked up the electric torch and turned it into the compartment. As he did so the other two stepped to his side, so that the three of them faced the unknown together. It was just as well. Outlined in that circle of light, and not 6 feet in front of them, stood a great chair upon a wide platform, and seated in it, erect and alert, his wide open eyes staring straight into those of the three, was the frightened, mountainous form of Strokor, the giant himself. For an indeterminable length of time the men from the earth stood there, speechless, unbreathing, staring at that awful monster as though at a nightmare. He did not move. He was entirely at ease, and yet plainly on guard, glaring at them with an air of conscious superiority which held them powerless. Instinctively they knew that the all-dominating voice in the records had belonged to this Hercules, but their instinct could not tell them whether the man still lived. It was the doctor's brain that worked first. Automatically, from a lifelong habit of diagnosis, he inspected that dreadful figure quite as though it were that of a patient. Bit by bit his subconscious mind pieced together the evidence. The man in the chair showed no signs of life. And after a while the doctor's conscious mind also knew. "He is dead," he said positively in his natural voice, and such was the vast relief of the other two that they were in no way startled by the sound. Instantly all three drew long breaths, the tension was relaxed, and Van Emmon's curiosity found a harsh and unsteady voice. "How under heaven has he been preserved all this time? Especially," he added, remembering, "considering the air that we found in the room." The doctor answered after a moment, his reply taking the form of advancing a step or two and holding out a hand. It touched glass. For the first time since the discovery the builder shifted the light. He had held it still as death for a full minute. Now he flashed it all about the place, and they saw that the huge figure was entirely encased in glass. The cabinet measured about 6 feet on each of its sides, and about 5 feet in height. But such were the squat proportions of the occupant that he filled the whole space. A slight examination showed that the case was not fixed to the platform, but had a separate bottom, upon which the stump-like chair was set. Also they found that thanks to the reduced pull of the planet, it was not hard for the three of them to lift the cabinet bodily, despite its weight of almost 1,000 pounds. They let the tools lie there, discarded as much weight as they could, and proceeded to carry that ages-old Superman out into the light. Here they could see that the great man was all but a negro in color. It was equally clear, however, from an examination of his mammoth cranium and extraordinary expression, that he was as highly developed along most mental lines as the greatest men on earth. It was the back of his head, however, so flat that it was only a continuation of his neck, or rather the shoulders, that told where the floor lay. That, together with the hardness of his eye, the cruelty of his mouth, and the absolute lack of softness anywhere in the iron-like face or frame, all this condemned the monster for what he was. Inhuman. It was not easy to get him down the 2 flights of stairs. More than once they had to prop the case on a step while they rested, and at one time, just before they reached that curious heap of rubbish at the foot of the upper stairs, Jackson's strength gave way, and it looked as though the whole thing would get away from them. Van Emmon saved it all at the cost of a bruised shoulder. Once at the bottom of the lower flight the rest was easy. Within a very few minutes the astonished face of the engineer was peering into the vestibule. He could hardly wait until the airtight door was locked before opening the inner valves. He stared at the mammoth figure in the case long and hard, and from then on showed a great deal of respect for his 3 friends. Of course, at that time the members of the expedition did not understand the conditions of Mercury as they are now known. They had to depend upon the general impression they got from their first-hand investigations, and it is remarkable that the doctor should have guessed so close to the truth. He must have made up his mind to outlast everybody else, was the way he put it as he kicked off his suit. He stepped up to the cabinet and felt of the glass. I wish it were possible, without breaking the case, to see how he was embalmed. His fingers still rested on the glass. Suddenly his eyes narrowed. He ran his fingers over the entire surface of the pane, and then whirled to stare at a thermometer. "That's mighty curious," he ejaculated. "This thing was bitter cold when we brought it in. Now it's already as warm as this car." Smith's eyes lit up. "It may be," he offered, "that the case doesn't contain a vacuum, but some gas which has an electrical affinity for our atmosphere." "Or," exclaimed the geologist suddenly, "the glass itself may be totally different from ours. It may be God!" shouted the doctor, jerking his hand from the cabinet and leaping straight backward. At the same instant, with a grinding crash, all 3 sides of the case collapsed and fell in splinters to the floor. "Look out!" shrieked Jackson. He was staring straight into the now unhooded eyes of the giant. He backed away, stumbled against a stool, and fell to the floor in a dead faint. Smith fumbled impotently with a hammer. The doctor was shaking like a leaf. But Van Emmon stood still in his tracks, his eyes fixed on the Goliath. His fingernails gashed the palms of his hands, but he would not budge. And as he stared he saw, from first to last, the whole ghastly change that came, after billions of years of waiting, to the sole survivor of Mercury. A glaze swept over the huge figure. Next instant every line in the adamant frame lost its strength. The hardness left the eyes and mouth. The head seemed to sink lower into the massive shoulders, and the irresistible hands relaxed. In another second the thing that had once been as iron had become as rubber. But only for an instant. Second by second the huge mountain of muscle slipped and jellied and actually melted before the eyes of the humans. At the same time a curious acrid odor arose. Smith fell to coughing. The doctor turned on more oxygen. In less than half a minute the man who had once conquered a planet was reduced to a steaming mound of brownish paste. As it sank to the floor of the case it touched a layer of coarse yellow powder sprinkled there, and it was this that caused the vapor. In a moment the room was filled with the haze of it. Luckily the doctor's apparatus worked well. And thus it came about that, within 5 minutes from being exposed to the air of the sky car, the whole immense bulk, chair and all, had vanished. The powder had turned it to vapor, and the purifying chemicals had sucked it up. Nothing was left save a heap of smoking, greyish ashes in the center of the broken glass. Van Emmon's fingers relaxed their grip. He stirred to action and turned briskly to Smith. "Here, help me with this thing." Between them they got the remains of the cabinet, with its gruesome load, into the vestibule. As for the doctor, he was bending over Jackson's still unconscious form. When he saw what the others were doing, he gave a sigh of relief. "Good." He helped them close the door. "Let's get away from this damned place." The outer door was opened. At the same time Smith started the machinery. and as the sky car shot away from the ground he tilted it slightly so that the contents of the vestibule were slid into space. Down it fell like so much lead. The Doctor glanced through a nearby window, and his face brightened as he made out the distant gleam of another planet. He watched the receding surface of Mercury with positive delight. "Nice place to get away from," he commented. "And now, my friends, for Venus. And then home." But the others' eyes were fixed upon a tiny sparkle in the dust outside the place where the vestibule had dropped its load. It was the sun shining upon some broken bits of glass, the glass which for untold ages had enclosed the throne of the Death Lord. Section 14